Hello everyone, I know you watched this video to accompany you to sleep. So if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, don't forget to tell me where you are from and what time you watched this video. Let's jump straight into the story. Story 1. Today's story began on a Saturday evening in July 2011 during a dance lesson when Joseph Saunier, a respected and wealthy pathologist, first met Rochelle Tina, a single man, famous in his city and beyond, enjoying freedom, status, and money, and a beautiful, sweet woman, almost 10 years younger than Joseph, successful and living a life of pleasure. Meeting on the dance floor was the beginning of their story, which unfortunately ended in tragedy. At that moment, when the ideal partnership in the dance grew into a tender and passionate romance, no one could not even imagine what events would follow after a while. The biography of Joseph Saunier, before meeting Rochelle, is a path full of joys and tragedies. Born in 1955 in a respected family of doctors in Shreveport, Louisiana, Joseph from childhood dreamed of continuing the work of the family and become a doctor. With outstanding abilities, the young man earned a Bachelor of Science in Medical Science cum laude from the University of Baton Rouge in 1976. He then applied to Louisiana State University in Shreveport and began working at Parkland Hospital in Dallas, Texas. The young man perfectly combined his university studies and work. He constantly took additional workload at the university and honed his knowledge and practice at the hospital. The management noticed the success and zeal of the young employee, and in the last year of training, he received the position of chief resident. Upon completion of his studies, Joseph chose the field of pathologic anatomy, later becoming a respected pathologist and laboratory director in Lubbock, Texas. Joseph's life was marked by the tragic loss of the woman he loved. His marriage, which lasted 27 years and which he considered happy, ended in divorce. His wife fell in love with another man. Joseph accepted her choice and agreed to divorce, believing that the man he loved had found his happiness. Dr. Saunier had a strong character and a great sense of nobility and responsibility. After the divorce, he maintained a very warm relationship with Becky and continued to support his two sons, showing resilience and strength of character. When Becky died 2 years later at the hands of her new husband Joseph, shocked by the heinous death of his former spouse, once again experienced a wave of grief and loss. He repeatedly recalled the family years gone by and mourned the loss. However, the doctor remained a pillar for the family. He immediately took over all the organizational issues and funeral expenses and helped his sons to survive the trauma. The children later admitted that it was his support that helped each of them overcome the pain. The tragedy left a deep mark on Joseph's heart. For a while, he fully devoted himself to work and the upbringing of two sons. Later, the grief he experienced led to a reassessment of life. The man decided to start a new personal chapter in a new city and with a new woman. In 2007, Dr. Saunier moved with his sons from Dallas to Lubbock, Texas, where he accepted a position as chief pathologist at Covenant Health System. Feeling the need for something new to refresh him and fill the void inside, Joseph enrolled in a local dance studio. He enjoyed the classes, also because it was a place where he met different women. A couple of times he even tried unsuccessfully to build relationships with his dance partners. And then one warm summer evening, Rochelle Tina appeared at the dance class. Elegant, graceful, refined woman with a sense of humor and lively eyes attracted Dr. Saunier's attention at first sight. Her smile lit up the room, and Joseph realized she was exactly who he was looking for. Rochelle, for her part, also noticed the confident and respectful man moving deftly on the dance floor. Rochelle, 47, and Joseph, 57, paired up, complementing each other perfectly in the dance. With each new session, they realized they were growing closer. Dr. Saunier suggested dating, and Rochelle agreed. Thus began a new, as it seemed at the time, happy chapter in the lives of both of them. Rochelle had an attractive and innate charm that had such a strong influence on men that they were willing to change their lives, destroy marriages, and commit criminal acts for her. Rochelle was one of those women who have a unique magnetism, attract attention, and cause passion. Such are called fatal women. Joseph and Rochelle's paths would not cross until a July evening, because she had previously lived in Amarillo, a couple hours by car from Lubbock. In fact, they were both starting a new life with a clean slate after personal love dramas. Leaving Amarillo, Dr. Saint's new lover was running away from the fear and anxiety associated with Mike Dixon, owner of a private clinic in plastic surgery and cosmetology. The woman met Mike in 2008 when she came in for Botox injections. Initially, there was a purely friendly communication, then a slight flirtation, after a spark between them, and then began a romance. Rochelle was a free, accomplished woman. For a long time, she worked as an executive in the NFL, built a successful career, and did not need anything. For children are grown. She owed no one anything. Unlike Mike, who was bound by the bonds of marriage, a plastic surgeon began leading a double life. A few months later, his wife found out about the affair and filed for divorce after 20 years of marriage. Mike was so infatuated with Rochelle that he almost did not notice how a huge stage of his life ended. He decisively separated from his wife. For Rochelle, who had never claimed to be married to Mike, an exciting affair from which she wanted only joy and ease turned into a union that required her to be just as maniacally obsessed with her partner. Not getting the attention he expected, Mike tried to pressure Rochelle, which only served to scare her away. Seeing the manipulation and the desire to completely control her life, the young woman decided to part with the plastic surgeon, and in 2010 the paths of former lovers parted. Nevertheless, even after the breakup, Mike for a long time pursued Rochelle, urging her to return. His obsession exceeded all healthy boundaries, forcing Rochelle to decide to move to disappear from his sight and free herself from his oppressive influence. But that's how Rochelle found herself in Labico, intent on starting a new life. Dr. Saunier and the beautiful, cheerful partner quickly hit it off. Gradually their relationship grew into true love. Sons and relatives willingly accepted the new lover and were happy for Joseph. The man spared nothing for her, showered her with gifts, invited to the best restaurants and private clubs in the city, took her on trips. After Joseph realized that he finally found a worthy woman with whom he was ready to tie his life, he took her to Los Angeles and in the presence of his entire family, made a proposal. At that moment, Rochelle was 47 years old, and she was literally crazy about her new man. Her personal page and social networks was filled almost daily with love confessions to Joseph. Of course, Mike Dixon couldn't help but see these confessions. The former lover was emotionally shocked to learn that Rochelle not only meets with a new man, but also openly confesses his love and is going to marry him. He realized that it would not be possible to get his former friend back, but he dared to offer her to resume the former format of meetings and become at least lovers. The idea to form a love triangle did not find a response. Rochelle firmly rejected the proposal and told Joseph about everything. The couple began to feel that they were being watched. At one point, they even noticed something resembling a camera flash through the backyard window, but they didn't pay much attention to it, not fully realizing the seriousness of the problem. The situation spiraled out of control on July 11, 2012. A landscaper who had arrived at the doctor's home to discuss an upcoming remodel contacted emergency services, but received no response. The man noticed an open door and, assuming Joseph might not be able to hear him, went inside. He saw the house in disarray, and most disturbing was the presence of a bullet hole near the front door indicating a possible intruder. The designer cautiously walked further inside in search of the homeowner and then examined the garage, where he found Joseph Saunier lying in a pool of blood on the floor with no signs of life. The doctor's body bore evidence of stab and gunshot wounds. Concluding that the perpetrator might be somewhere nearby, the designer immediately left the house and summoned help by telephone. At 2:48 in the afternoon, the police department received a call and several patrol cars were immediately dispatched to the scene. Arriving officers found the victim of the crime, identified as Joseph Saunier, a 57-year-old pathologist. Medics confirmed the death of his colleague. The incident shocked the public as it occurred in one of the city's most peaceful, safe, and upscale neighborhoods with virtually zero crime. Dr. Saunier, a member of a respected profession, was known for his calmness and kindness and had no apparent enemies willing to harm him. Although a window had been broken, what had happened was not a robbery, for nothing was missing from the house. A bottle with the bottom shot through was found at the scene. It appeared to have been used as an improvised silencer for a firearm. A short time later, a forensic team arrived to collect evidence for examination. Apparently, the assailant was inexperienced as he left ample traces at the scene. DNA collected from the bottle used as a silencer and blood samples found were sent to a lab for further testing. There were no CCTV cameras near the house. According to the investigation, the perpetrator entered the house using a panoramic window overlooking the backyard, a circumstance that made his attack unexpected. In the dining room, the attacker confronted his victim and began shooting. It was most likely at this point that the wine bottle was used as a silencer. Judging by the traces of blood left in the hallway, the doctor was still alive after the shots were fired. He went into the garage where the attacker caught up with him and stabbed the victim a number of times. An autopsy on the body found 5 gunshot wounds and 11 stab wounds. The circumstances indicated that the murder was not a random crime. What remained unclear was who had done it and why. The investigation focused on the pathologist's close social circle. During an interview with law enforcement, the victim's fiancée recounted strange events in her and Joseph's life in the last months before the tragedy. According to her, it appeared that Dr. Sonier was being stalked. In addition, Rochelle herself had seen a stranger standing in front of Joseph's house watching the door and windows. She also described persistent calls and texts that began to be received by her fiancé just prior to his death, but believed the calls and messages came from other women with whom Joseph appeared to be in a parallel relationship, as there were witnesses who said the man was in contact with several women at once. Investigators asked Rochelle if she was aware of the other women. She answered that she was not. Joseph's sons denied the possibility that their father could have had mistresses, as cheating is not in the character of their father. However, investigators continued to develop a version of the crime motivated by jealousy. At the next interrogation, Rochelle could not withstand the pressure, cried and admitted that she knew several women, probably involved in the crime. According to her, several former girlfriends were constantly stalking Joseph. He ignored them, but they never stopped expressing their displeasure about his future wedding. One of them turned out to be a lady from Florida, who continued to persistently call and write even after Dr. Sonier revealed his serious relationship with Rochelle. Another was a nurse, a colleague of the pathologist, who also called and wrote to him regularly. The third was a woman with a daughter who, shortly before the murder, had sent a letter to Joseph, accusing him of abandoning her and her child. At the same interview, Rochelle mentioned Mike Dixon for the first time. Until then, she hadn't connected the surveillance of her and Joseph to Mike, since Mike had completely stopped paying attention after her refusal to become a mistress. She assumed he had accepted her marriage and moved on with his life. The police had a viable suspect, and they went to talk to the plastic surgeon. Mike willingly went to talk to the detectives. He admitted that he had indeed been deeply in love with Rochelle and had divorced his wife in the name of that love in an effort to create an opportunity for their future together. He admitted that the separation was a blow to him, and for some time he tried to get Rochelle back. She remained adamant, however, and he eventually relented and found a new woman considerably younger than himself. His new girlfriend, a medical student, confirmed his alibi, as Mike was at work at the time of the crime and then spent time with her. The investigation ran into difficulties. All the suspects, including Rochelle herself, had incontrovertible alibis. Detectives tried to identify possible enemies of the murdered or people financially interested in his death, but no new figures were found. By the time the lab results came back, the situation appeared to be a dead end. The forensic results, unfortunately, did not add any clarity. The DNA sample from the bottle did not belong to the victim. However, the police database was unable to determine whose sample was found at the crime scene. And that's when law enforcement officials got unusually lucky. The police department received a call from Paul Reynolds, an aspiring EMT from Amarillo. According to him, he was sharing housing with a buddy named Dave Shepard, who had recently confessed to a murder committed in Lubbock, after which he attempted to take his own life, but was rescued. Paul relayed information that a neighbor had told him details of the crime, including specific details that only a small circle of detectives might have known, such as the use of a bottle muffler. The officers realized that Shepard was indeed involved in the crime. A witness who called claimed that Dave was only the perpetrator, and that the person who ordered the crime was an unknown doctor associated with plastic surgery. Officers immediately began running a background check on the new suspect, and found that Shepard had a violent criminal history with theft and hooliganism, but no major crimes. They determined that he was divorced, unemployed, and had been caught stealing on several occasions, including one where he stole $30,000 from a prominent businessman. Dave was taken to the station for questioning, and pretty quickly he began to confess, confirming that Mike Dixon had indeed hired him to commit the crime. According to Dave, the meeting with the plastic surgeon took place in a bar where both found themselves going through painful breakups with their partners. Under the influence of alcohol, the casual conversation turned into a true friendship. Mike Dixon told a sad love story, complained about Rochelle. who had left him and was now about to marry someone else. The man shared that he can't get over his former partner and is willing to do anything to get her back. Deciding that the only obstacle is Dr. Sonier, Mike and Dave devise a plan. However, their intentions, according to Dave, did not include murder. They simply wanted to slander the pathologist so that proud Rochelle would leave him and want to return to Mike. They found women who were paid handsome sums of money, $1,000 each, to play the role of mistresses and pursue Sonia. Then came a letter from a woman with a child claiming that Joseph had abandoned her. Dr. Sonia denied it each time, and Rochelle believed him. It also turned out that the camera flash the couple had seen was the light from Dave's cell phone flashlight, who regularly drove to their house and played up the surveillance. Each such trip was financed by Mike Dixon, handing out money for gas and related expenses. When spying and slander failed to separate the lovers, Mike set out to fix the problem in a radical way. He told his friend that he wanted him to kill the pathologist. As payment, Dixon offered 3 silver bars totaling about $10,000. Dave agreed. One of the bars given as a deposit, the hired killer immediately cashed in at a pawn shop. When he arrived at Dr. Sonier's house, things got out of control. It was an unintentional shooting. I got scared, and he started walking away down the hallway. When I came to my senses from the shock, I shouted, "Dr. Sonier, are you all right?" Hearing nothing back, I followed him into the garage. He was lying there flat. I distinctly heard his last breath, and I bent down to check his pulse. There was no pulse. In his confession, Shepard claimed that he allegedly stabbed Joseph Sonier in an irrational and foolish attempt to cover up what he called involuntary manslaughter. "I stabbed him a couple times. I don't remember how many times." "You say I stabbed 11 times?" I had Dr. Sonier's phone in my hand, and I thought about dialing the emergency number to call for help, but I didn't. Maybe that's why 11 times. I put the phone back, mutilated the remains. Then I went to Mike's, got the rest of the bullion, and tried to kill myself. According to Dave agreeing to the crime, he did not understand what he was agreeing to. And when he found himself in front of Joseph, he realized that he could not kill. Had it not been for an accidental gunshot, Dr. Sonier would still be alive. The plastic surgeon was apprehended by police the same day on charges of first-degree murder based on Dave's testimony and an extensive body of other evidence, including compromising phone calls and text messages containing explicit confessions. At the first interview, detectives hoped to elicit a confession, but Mike Dixon stubbornly denied everything, demanding an attorney. A lawsuit ensued. Dave Shepard, as part of a deal with the prosecutor, immediately pleaded guilty to his role as a hired criminal and waived the right to appeal the sentence. As a result, instead of the death penalty, he received a life sentence without parole. Mike Dixon, against whom there was only pleaded not guilty. Unexpectedly, Dave, who was a key witness for the prosecution, testified during the trial that he committed the crime on his own without any involvement of Dixon in it. Under oath, he said that the silver bars were intended for investment in a business the two of them had intended to start. The jury was unable to reach a unanimous verdict, and a retrial was declared. The second trial took place in 2016. Dixon was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. An appeal filed by his lawyers led to the reversal of the judgment. The man was released on bail in the amount of $2 million, but the fight for justice did not end. The prosecutor's office sought to have the sentence reinstated by the highest criminal court of the state. Otherwise, a third trial was to be held. The prosecutor's office's motion, filed on February 11, 2019, was granted. In April 2020, the bail was revoked and an arrest warrant was again issued. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals reversed the lower court's decision and reinstated Mike Dixon's sentence. The judge ruled that the felon must continue to serve his life sentence without parole. Mike Dixon is currently incarcerated in a prison in Lubbock, Texas. Dr. Joseph Sonier became part of the love triangle when he began dating Rochelle in July 2011. The woman still calls him the main love of her life and regrets that she unknowingly led a criminal to a noble, loving, and honest man. Story 2. South America, 2009. In the sweltering December heat of Cali, Colombia, 2009, the city simmered with tension like a pot long forgotten on a stove. Streets buzzed with motorbike engines and shouts in rapid-fire Spanish, while the neighborhoods, some choked with the scent of bougainvillea and grilled meat, others cloaked in silence and fear, stood as silent testimonies to two worlds living in a fragile truce. In the hills beyond the city proper, where the homes grew poorer and the law thinner, Ruben Aguilar crouched beside a wooden crate of contraband weapons, a cigarette pinched between his fingers, its smoke curling upward like a final prayer. He was not a soldier anymore, not officially, but the discipline still lingered in the tight line of his back and the methodical way he checked the weaponry. Inside the crates were Belgian FNFALs, clean, oiled, and illegal. They were bound for the cartel's rural outposts deep in the Valle del Cauca, but they were also Ruben's ticket out of obscurity and into the real power structure of the fractured criminal empire that had ruled these hills since before he was born. For Ruben, the job had started small. He had been a street enforcer, a driver, a glorified errand boy with a mean left hook and a bad reputation in 2 neighborhoods. But after surviving a prison stint that was supposed to end him, he came out leaner, meaner, and most importantly connected. He had impressed Don Isidro, one of the Cali cartel's mid-tier lieutenants, a man who understood the value of ambition wrapped in silence. Don Isidro had a plan to carve out a new arm of the cartel, specializing not in the cocaine highways already saturated with risk and federal scrutiny, but in a new market, weapons trafficking. The government crackdowns in Venezuela had disrupted old arms routes, and paramilitaries needed guns. Ruben saw it instantly. It was the future. And the shipment in front of him, worth nearly $500,000, would mark the beginning of that future, provided everything went according to plan. But in Colombia, nothing ever did. The pickup was supposed to be discreet. Ruben's men, 3 ex-soldiers and a boy named Christian who'd never held a rifle until 2 weeks ago, were to load the crates into a cattle truck at midnight, drive through the rural outskirts, and meet with a contact near the town of Buga. The buyers were FARC dissidents, operating independently and flush with black market cash. Everyone had something to gain. Ruben would earn enough to fund a second shipment. Don Isidro would gain prestige, and the rebels would continue their fight with freshly oiled weapons. But as the last crate was sealed and the truck's engine rumbled to life, Ruben felt it, that subtle shift in the air, the quiet that falls just before something terrible happens. They were halfway out of the city limits, past the checkpoints where bribes had already been paid and police were trained to look the other way, when the ambush hit. It was professional, too professional. The first explosion lifted the rear axle of the truck, sending metal and livestock into the night. Ruben, driving the lead car, instinctively killed the lights and veered off the road, tires skidding on gravel, hand already on the pistol holstered beneath his seat. Automatic fire erupted from the tree line, slicing through the truck and its driver in seconds. The boy Christian screamed once, then nothing. Ruben rolled into a drainage ditch, mud coating his jeans, and stayed perfectly still, listening. The attackers weren't rebels. They didn't use jungle tactics. These were urban men, well-fed, well-trained. And they weren't there to steal the guns. They were there to send a message. When it was over, Ruben crawled out and surveyed the wreckage. The truck was a burning skeleton. His men were dead. The crates were gone. No, not gone, destroyed. Shot to splinters and left to burn. Whoever had done this didn't want the weapons in circulation. They wanted a disruption. He recognized the mark instantly. This had the stink of Mateo Correa, an old rival from the northern ports, who'd lost control of a Venezuelan shipping lane Ruben had recently co-opted. Mateo was the kind of man who didn't retaliate with lawyers or words. He retaliated with bullets. Ruben had known it was only a matter of time, but this was something bigger. At dawn, Ruben returned to the city, bloodied, burned, and very much alive. He made his way to Don Isidro's estate, a sleek compound behind steel gates and manicured hedges that disguised the blood on the hands of everyone inside. Don Isidro listened in silence as Ruben laid it out, everything from the ambush to the evidence that Mateo was behind it. The old man's eyes narrowed, his fingers tapping slowly on the oak desk, knuckles gnarled like tree roots. This was not just business, Don Isidro said finally, his voice a gravelly whisper. This was war. Ruben nodded, the bruise on his cheek already darkening. Then let me wage it. Don Isidro studied him for a long moment before nodding. You'll get one shot. No mistakes. We strike first, and we strike clean. Mateo thinks we're soft, too caught up in cocaine and dollars to remember the old codes. Show him we remember. And so the counterstrike was born. Not a street hit, not a sloppy car bomb or a barroom execution, but a surgical attack on Mateo's central operation, the San Fernando shipping hub in Barranquilla. The plan was simple. Ruben and a crew of 5 would infiltrate the terminal at night, plant charges in the central warehouse, and erase Mateo's access to the Caribbean routes in one fiery act of vengeance. But simple plans rarely survived first contact with reality. Reuben knew this, and still he welcomed the fire. He needed to send a message of his own, not just to Mateo, but to every doubter in the cartel who saw him as an expendable soldier. When they reached Barranquilla 3 nights later, the mood was electric. The team, hand-picked mercenaries from Isidro's elite, moved with the silence of ghosts. They bypassed the outer fence with ease, disabling cameras and guards with cold efficiency. Reuben moved among them like a conductor in a symphony of destruction. He planted the charges with precision, counting seconds between breaths. But just as they were setting the final detonator, a sound cracked through the silence, a cough, then a flashlight beam, then shouting, and the sudden, blinding eruption of gunfire. The gunfire tore through the humid Barranquilla night like thunder in a stormless sky. Reuben dove behind a stack of shipping pallets, splinters biting into his arms as bullets shredded the air above. His team scattered, returning fire with short, controlled bursts. These weren't rent-a-cops or half-drunk dockhands. These were trained men, likely hired by Mateo himself, maybe even off-duty military. The ambush was too precise to be coincidence. Someone had leaked their movements. There were eyes inside Don Isidro's house, watching, listening, feeding scraps to Mateo like a starving dog. The betrayal stung, but Reuben shoved it aside. Right now, there was only one mission: complete the sabotage and survive the escape. He shouted a command, sharp and guttural, over the cacophony of shots. 2 of his men peeled off, drawing fire as Reuben scrambled to the final charge. The detonator lay exposed beneath a steel crate, half buried in gravel and diesel. He armed it with shaking hands, hearing the metallic click of a cartridge sliding into a chamber somewhere behind him. There was no time to double-check, no time to plan. He slammed the trigger into place, tapped the wireless control box, and sprinted for cover just as a shot grazed his shoulder, spinning him sideways into a rusted loading trolley. He hit the ground hard, vision blurring. Pain radiated down his arm in hot waves, and he couldn't tell if the blood soaking his shirt was his own or someone else's. A shadow loomed above him, boots crunching gravel, gun barrel descending. Instinct took over. Reuben kicked out, catching the man in the knee, rolled beneath the truck, and fired twice. The body dropped, twitching. He didn't wait to check if it was over. He rolled to his feet, found the detonator's frequency, and slammed the red button. The explosion didn't disappoint. Fire engulfed the San Fernando terminal in a howling roar that turned night into day. Metal screamed. Crates flew like shrapnel. Smoke rose in a column that could be seen from the slums to the coastline. It wasn't just a strike, it was an act of war, carved into the skyline with fire and ruin. Reuben didn't look back as he and the 2 surviving men fled through the chaos, ducking between burning containers, their lungs scorched by smoke and adrenaline. They reached the getaway car, an unmarked van disguised as a fish vendor, and tore out of the harbor district at full speed. Behind them, the terminal collapsed in sections, explosions triggering chain reactions that consumed fuel tanks and cargo alike. Mateo's empire, at least this arm of it, was dead. But Reuben knew too well that fire bred only more fire in South America. Retaliation would come, swift and without mercy. Still, the success of the mission gave him a currency more valuable than dollars: respect. They laid low for a week in a safe house outside Medellin, deep in the countryside where government patrols rarely ventured. Reuben's shoulder wound festered before healing. News of the terminal bombing spread quickly. Cartel circles whispered his name with a mix of fear and reverence. Some claimed he'd killed 20 men in the ambush. Others said he'd walked through the flames untouched. Legends bloomed in blood-soaked soil, and Reuben didn't care to correct them. Let them mythologize him. Fear was more useful than truth. When he finally returned to Cali, Don Isidro greeted him not with applause or praise, but silence. The old man stood beneath the jacaranda tree in his courtyard, cigar clutched between yellowing fingers, eyes unreadable. He nodded once. "You've started something you cannot stop." Reuben didn't flinch. "I never planned to stop." Isidro studied him, then motioned for him to follow. Inside the study, past the rows of dusty ledgers and lacquered maps, he handed Reuben a dossier. Inside were photos of known traitors, names, faces, addresses. One of them had betrayed the operation. Reuben recognized one instantly. A bodyguard named Lucho, the same man who poured drinks at every party and never spoke unless spoken to. Quiet, forgettable, dangerous. "Handle it," Isidro said. And so Reuben became not just a soldier, but an executioner. Over the next 3 days, he hunted each man listed in the dossier, leaving their corpses in alleys, clubs, and abandoned farms. Each kill was personal, fast, and final. No speeches. No mercy. The message was clear: loyalty was life, and betrayal would be buried. By January 2010, Ruben was no longer just Don Isidro's lieutenant. He had his own crew, his own territory, his own whispers in the dark corners of Colombia's underworld. The arms business was back on track, rerouted through Ecuador with corrupt naval officers smoothing the way. He bought properties in 3 cities. Bought his mother a villa in Popayan. Bought silence from the police, loyalty from the judges, and loyalty from the desperate. But the ghosts never left. Late at night, in the stillness before dawn, Ruben sometimes heard the cries. The boy Christian, screaming once in that burning truck. The gunshot that grazed his shoulder. The face of Lucho as the last breath left him. Power came with a toll, and Ruben had paid in pieces of his soul. But in the world he'd built, that was a small price. In South America, the rules were never written, they were carved in blood. And Ruben Aguilar, once a nameless enforcer, was now one of the authors. The future stretched before him like an unmarked graveyard, endless, cold, and full of opportunity. Let's jump to next story. Story 3. South America, 2008. The rain fell like bullets on the tin rooftops of Belém, where the Amazon's breath tangled with diesel smoke and the whisper of machetes beneath coats. In the damp murk of the old port quarter, the city's true commerce moved. Coke in crates of bananas, counterfeit euros in tuna cans, ghost guns tucked in fishing nets. To outsiders, it was chaos. But to Rafael "Rafa" Montes, it was a symphony. He understood its rhythm better than any conductor. He knew when to bribe, when to bleed, when to vanish. That Tuesday evening in June, as the sky bruised violet over the river, he waited in a rusted warehouse with 3 men and a suitcase that could change everything. Inside, $500,000 in marked bills, bait for a trap, payment for a promise no one intended to keep. The men with him were loyal in the way only desperation could buy. Diego, the ex-military sniper turned security chief, leaned against a crate of sugar, polishing his pistol with a stained cloth. Tomas, thin and twitchy, bounced a knife between his fingers like a toy. The last, little Julian, barely 20, wore the wide-eyed look of someone who hadn't yet killed for money, but would if Rafa told him to. They were waiting for Colonel Batista, an ex-police commander turned broker for the Gavallo cartel, which controlled most of the para-state coke flow to Suriname and across the Atlantic. Batista had a reputation for brutality in business, in that order, and Rafa's plan required both. The deal was supposed to be simple. Batista delivers 3 crates of uncut product, Rafa pays, and they all walk away. But nothing in Belém stayed simple for long. Rafa's plan wasn't about product, it was about betrayal. A month earlier, his cousin had been found face down in the river, throat slit, floating like trash. He'd been working for Batista, moving loads through river barges. Rafa knew it hadn't been an accident, and he'd spent the weeks since arranging this meet, pulling strings through police, border patrol, and traffickers like a puppeteer with bloodied gloves. The suitcase of marked cash would tie Batista to federal corruption charges. The hidden camera in the warehouse's corner would feed the whole transaction live to a judge Rafa had bought 3 nights ago with a suitcase just like this one. By dawn, the colonel would be in shackles, and Rafa would step into the vacuum he left behind. But the warehouse stank of more than fish and mildew that night. It stank of wrongness. Diego's eyes kept flicking toward the alley, and Julian's fingers twitched near his waistband. Even Tomas stopped spinning his blade. When Batista finally appeared, he wasn't alone. 4 men flanked him, all in plain clothes, but none of them moved like gang muscle. They moved like soldiers, smooth, deliberate, trained. Rafa's stomach tightened. Something had shifted, and he didn't like it. Batista smiled the way snakes do, stepping into the puddled light. "Senor Montes," he said, voice syrupy. "You came prepared." Rafa kept his expression flat. "Business demands it." The colonel glanced at the suitcase. "May I? After I see the product." Batista nodded. One of his men stepped forward, opened a black duffel. Inside, kilos of white wrapped tight in plastic, stamped with the Gavallo crest. Good stuff. Or at least it looked that way. But Rafa wasn't here for the powder. He was watching Batista's eyes, the twitch at the corner of his jaw, the way his fingers drummed his thigh. He was nervous. That meant he knew. Someone had tipped him. Rafa had one chance left. He signaled with his fingers, subtle, low by his hip. Diego straightened. Tomas palmed his blade. The air thickened. Batista's men shifted. And then, too fast for thought, someone opened fire. Gunfire ripped through the warehouse like a cyclone. Diego dropped one of Batista's men before taking a round in the chest. Tomas lunged, blade slicing into a neck, before another burst sent him crumpling against the wall. Rafa dove behind a pallet of canned fish, bullets tearing through cardboard and flesh alike. He didn't see where Julian fell. Blood soaked the floor, mixing with river silt and oil. He gritted his teeth and crawled toward the suitcase. It was still intact, forgotten in the chaos. He grabbed it, then lunged for the emergency door behind a tarp. The rain swallowed him instantly, masking the sounds of pursuit. He didn't look back. Rafa ran alley to alley, soaked and bleeding. The suitcase thumped against his side like a heartbeat. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He'd underestimated Batista, misread the man's greed, or overestimated his own leverage. Somewhere, someone had flipped. And now the plan was ash, and the city would burn with it. By the time he reached the safe house, his breath came in ragged gasps. He threw open the metal door, slammed it shut, bolted it. The lights flickered. It was empty. No backup. No one waiting. The camera feed had cut off minutes into the firefight. He didn't know if the judge had seen enough. He didn't know if the suitcase of evidence was now just bloodied currency in a failed vendetta. He slumped in a chair, pistol across his lap, suitcase between his feet, and let the silence press in. He'd lost too much tonight. Friends, trust, control. But he wasn't dead. And in Balem, survival was the first rule of power. Revenge came next. The sun rose reluctantly over the sprawl of Balem, casting a jaundiced glow on rust-stained walls, narrow alleys, and blood-stained secrets still drying in the gutters. Rafael Montes had not slept. He sat where he had collapsed 5 hours before, his mind chewing on every detail of the ambush, every twitch of Batista's eye, every flash of betrayal that had unfolded in that warehouse like some cursed opera. The suitcase sat unopened beside him, its weight no longer symbolic, just the cold metal reminder of how far he had miscalculated. And yet, as the shadows of morning stretched long across the tiles, Rafa's expression was no longer panic. It had hardened into something else, calculation. The failed sting was not the end of his plan. It was the beginning of another. The first move came with the sound of a knock, soft, coded, 5 short taps and 2 long ones. Rafa stood, gun raised, and opened the door a crack. On the other side was a woman in a red poncho and motorcycle helmet, visor down. He stepped aside. She entered without a word. Only after the door was bolted did she remove the helmet, revealing sharp eyes and a scar across her left cheek. Her name was Isabella, and she ran intel for the Jaguar Network, an off-books collective of ex-agents, traffickers, and journalists who traded secrets like weapons. Rafa had once saved her brother from a Guyana prison, and the debt was not yet forgotten. "They killed Batista this morning," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Execution style. His men, probably. Or yours, if they flipped after you ran." Rafa sat up. "Dead? That wasn't in the news." Isabella gave him a look. "Because it won't be." His body was dumped in the Ananindua wetlands with 5 rounds in the back of his head. Word on the street is he was trying to broker a deal with the wrong people. "Your name was mentioned." Rafa's lips curled, not in surprise, but grim recognition. Someone wanted to erase all evidence of the deal, and Batista had been just one thread. That meant the noose would tighten fast around everyone who had seen that suitcase, everyone who knew what had gone down, including him. "There's more," Isabella continued. "A judge was found dead last night. Suicide, supposedly. Slashed wrists in a hotel bathtub. Room paid in cash. Guess who signed the register?" Rafa's stomach dropped. "Me? No. Someone using your name." It was worse than a tip-off. It was a frame job. Batista's men hadn't just retaliated. They had reshaped the narrative. Rafa was now the villain of a story written by ghosts. The dead judge. The failed sting. The trail of money. And Batista's corpse, stitched with bullets. If he didn't act fast, he wouldn't just be hunted. He'd be erased. He stood, pulling the suitcase close, then looked at Isabella. "I need passage out, but not forever. Just long enough to regroup." She raised a brow. "Out? To where?" "Suriname first. Then Paramaribo. I've got a contact there, Rico Montero. He moves code and currency. He can wash the cash, build me something new to work with. A second skin." Isabella considered. "You have 12 hours. I'll get you across the river. But after that, you're on your own." Rafa nodded. That's all I need. 12 hours later, under a different sky, Raphael drifted along the Suriname River in a slow-moving ferry painted like a party boat, filled with tourists too hungover to ask questions. His forged papers named him Andres Silva, an electronics trader from Recife. The suitcase sat beneath his seat, stripped of trackers, its contents swapped for clean euros and encrypted flash drives. He wore a plain shirt, no jewelry, no watch. He looked like no one, and that was the idea. But inside, he seethed. This wasn't escape, it was regrouping. Rafa was no longer interested in climbing the cartel ladder. He wanted to cut it down, rung by rung, and bury it in the river. He had names. He had faces. He had debts to collect. Batista's second-in-command, known only as Morcego. The judge's rival, who'd wanted the sting to fail. Even his own lieutenant, Julian, who had survived the shootout but vanished soon after, perhaps because he had warned Batista. By the time Rafa reached Paramaribo, he had a plan. The city was a slower tempo than Belém, but just as corrupt. There were border guards who would kill for 50 euros, customs agents who smuggled heroin in their children's backpacks. Rico Montero welcomed him with a smirk and a glass of rum, and by midnight, the suitcase had been dismantled and digitized. Its cash funneled through dummy corporations, laundered through e-casinos, turned into leverage. Over the next 3 weeks, people began to disappear. Morcego's car exploded outside a nightclub in Macapa. No witnesses, no footage, just red mist and a headline. The crooked customs chief in Belém died in a supposed hunting accident. A news anchor in São Luís leaked documents from an anonymous source, implicating half the Para state police in trafficking. And finally, in a safe house in Boa Vista, Julian was found poisoned. Next to him, a note in Rafa's handwriting. Debt settled. The city began to whisper the name Rafael Montes again. Not as a fugitive, not as a failure, but as a ghost, a revenant of vengeance, moving across borders, pulling strings no one could see. By August, the Gavallo cartel structure had splintered. Smaller outfits fought for dominance. Corrupt officials resigned in panic. Rafa, now operating under a dozen aliases, began rebuilding, not a cartel but a network. Lean, hidden, surgical. No more wide-open stings. No more suitcases in warehouses. Only whispers, data, precision. Crime in his hands became not a blunt force, but a scalpel. As the year ended and rains returned to the Amazon basin, washing away the blood and bullet casings of a dozen dirty deals, Rafael Montes stood on the balcony of a rented flat overlooking the Atlantic in Fortaleza. He sipped strong coffee and watched the cargo ships slip through the dawn. He no longer carried the scars of 2008 on his face, but they lived in his silence. And somewhere in the shadows of South America, another suitcase waited, locked, loaded, ready for war. Let's jump to next story. Story 4. South America, 2007. In the sprawling city of Medellin, Colombia, nestled within the folds of the Iburra Valley, 2007 was a year when the rain seemed to fall with less forgiveness and the nights grew heavier with silence. Silence broken only by the click of latches, the scrape of knives, and the soft hum of motorbikes ferrying secrets and sins through alleys too narrow for sunlight. Among the millions who lived beneath the shadows of old drug empires and fading political promises was a man known only as Silvio Aguirre. A name passed through whispered conversations, a ghost in the books of corrupt police commanders, and a whisper too dangerous to speak aloud in cartel circles. Silvio was a broker of men, a seller of information, a manipulator of bloodlines. Not quite a killer, but never quite innocent either. He didn't pull the trigger, he sold the gun, the bullet, the address, and sometimes even the motivation. And in 2007, he was about to make the mistake of thinking he had outgrown fear. The job came, as most did, through a cryptic message left in a florist's book, lavender pressed between the pages of a dead novel. A note, scrawled in the same hurried hand he recognized from old communiques with former FARC contacts, told him to meet at Cerro Nudabara, just past dusk. It had no name, no payment terms, just a time, a place, and a symbol, a circle around a serpent's head. Silvio frowned. That symbol hadn't been used in years. Not since the days when the Narcosur collective still operated openly in the southern jungles. They had splintered long ago, fractured by internal betrayals, DEA stings, and too many young fools with itchy fingers and empty dreams. If someone was using that mark again, it meant one of two things. Someone was pretending to be bigger than they were, or someone who'd been buried had clawed their way back into the light. He met them just as the street lamps blinked to life, their orange glow turning the statue of Pueblito Paisa into a smudged silhouette against the dusky sky. There were 3 of them, 2 men in cheap leather jackets, the kind that hung too loose or too tight, and a woman with eyes like obsidian who said nothing but stared as if she were carving his face into her memory. The taller man, who introduced himself only as Mateo, slid a photograph across the table between them. It was grainy old, taken with a long lens through fogged glass. But the face was unmistakable. "His name is Salvador Tellez," Mateo said. "You know him?" Silvio took a moment. He did. Tellez had once been a mid-tier logistics man for the Rodriguez clan out of Cali, specializing in port schedules, surveillance gaps, and border manipulation. But he had vanished in '99 after a failed shipment left 4 dead federals floating off the coast of Tumaco. Most had presumed him dead, Silvio included. But now here was proof, cold and undeniable, that Tellez had not only survived, but reinvented himself under a new name in a coastal district in Peru. The question, then, was not whether Silvio could find him. The real question was, who wanted him found? "What's he worth to you?" Silvio asked, sipping his tinto. The bitterness helped mask the tension crawling up his spine. Mateo didn't answer directly. He betrayed a cause. And worse, he took something that didn't belong to him. Silvio leaned back. "Something like money?" "No," said the woman, speaking for the first time, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Like names." It clicked then. This wasn't about revenge. It was about insurance. Tellez had stolen something coded, something stored. Maybe a list of operatives, or a ledger of payments implicating higher powers. Whatever it was, it had enough weight to bring old ghosts back from their graves. And if these 3 were as desperate as they looked, then they weren't the only ones chasing him. Silvio agreed to the job with a nod. Not because the money would be good. It would. But because a whisper deep in his gut told him that this trail would lead far beyond Peru, beyond Tellez, even beyond the crumbling framework of what used to be Narcosur. He didn't trust any of them, but he trusted the chaos they promised more than the silence he had been living with for too long. By the end of the week, Silvio had crossed the Ecuadorian border, using one of his older identities. Joaquin Benitez, a field logistics analyst for a non-existent agricultural think tank. In Lima, he rented a room in a crumbling guest house, its windows warped from salt and time. He bribed his way into Port Authority databases, greased the hands of half-drunk dock workers, and even leaned on an old flame, Lorena, who now worked in customs. Slowly, the web closed. Tellez, now living under the name Carlos Jimeno, had reinvented himself as a wine merchant in Trujillo, shipping vintage crates that never got opened, receiving containers that always cleared with minimal inspection. It was a perfect cover, but too perfect. One day, Silvio followed one of the shipments inland and saw it offloaded in a warehouse that didn't even pretend to store wine. Instead, it housed something far more dangerous: hard drives, cameras, and weapons. Data, blackmail, instruments of leverage. Whatever Tellez had taken, he wasn't just protecting it. He was using it. Silvio's next step wasn't to make contact. It was to make a deal. He reached out to Mateo and the woman, whose name he now learned was Dahlia, and offered them a simple choice. Let him speak to Tellez first, alone, and he would guarantee a clean handoff. No blood, no noise. They agreed, reluctantly. Perhaps they sensed what he did, that Tellez was not afraid of being caught, but afraid of who might come next. He met Salvador Tellez in a rooftop bar overlooking the river at dusk, the kind of place where the sound of gunfire would vanish into the hum of city traffic. The man was older, balding, but his eyes were sharp, tired, haunted. Silvio sat across from him and placed the photo from Medellin on the table. "I know who you are," he said, "but the real question is, who else does?" Tellez looked at the photo, then back at Silvio. "I was wondering when someone would come. And now that you're here," Tellez said, "I'm going to tell you something that will make you wish you hadn't taken the job." Silvio raised an eyebrow. "I've heard that before." "No," Tellez said, leaning forward. "You haven't. Because this isn't about me. It's about what I found. And once you know it, you'll be hunted just like I am." Silvio felt it then, the ground shifting beneath his chair, the realization that this wasn't just a retrieval mission. It was a trap disguised as a favor, and the bait had been silence itself. Because some information doesn't just get traded or sold. Some information binds you to it, poisons you with its weight, and ensures that once you've seen it, you're never clean again. The pause between Salvador Tellez's warning and Silvio's reply stretched longer than the wind that howled off the river. For a heartbeat, Silvio felt something he hadn't felt since the summer of '99, when he watched a man be gutted in the belly of a jungle hut for leaking a safe house location. Pure dread. It wasn't just the weight of Tellez's words that unsettled him. It was the calm in his voice, the resignation in his eyes. This wasn't a man bluffing to buy time. Tellez had already surrendered to the inevitability of his death. Now he was simply choosing who to bring down with him. "What did you find?" Silvio asked finally. Tellez didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a flash drive. It was small, nondescript, the kind you'd find in an office drawer or school bag. Yet Silvio could tell by the way Tellez held it that it might as well have been a stick of uranium. He placed it carefully on the table between them, like a priest offering communion. "This drive contains records, real records. Not the usual slush funds or transit logs. No, this is a ledger of relationships. Names, locations, meetings, high-level ones. Politicians, judges, generals, people whose hands are supposed to be clean." Silvio stared at it without touching it. "And you stole this?" "Found it," Tellez replied, lighting a cigarette with a trembling hand. "I was hired to intercept a delivery for the Russian mob in Bolivia. I wasn't told what it was, just where to find it and who to kill. But the courier was smarter than expected. It turned into a firefight, and he bled out with the case chained to his wrist. I broke the lock, expecting diamonds or cash. Instead, I found this drive and a note. For Zurich drop. Secure channel only. That was 2 years ago. And you've kept it hidden ever since?" "I've tried, but they're closing in. And if I go down, I need someone to know what this really is. Someone who understands how deep this goes. Not a journalist. Not a priest. A broker. Someone who trades in shadows." Tellez looked at him directly. "That's why you're here, Silvio. Whether you realize it or not." Silvio didn't reach for the drive. Not yet. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and took a breath. Everything in his life had taught him that information is only power if you know how to survive its weight. This wasn't just data. It was a blueprint for collapse. If what Tellez said was true, then the people on that drive didn't just want him dead, they needed it. Desperately. Blood would be spilled to protect what it contained. "You're marked," Silvio said. "If I take this, so am I." "Yes," Tellez said. "But if you leave it, you'll be hunted anyway. Now that we've spoken, your name will be attached to mine." Silvio finally picked up the flash drive. It was lighter than he expected, its plastic casing warm from the heat of the setting sun. He slid it into the inside pocket of his jacket, sealing his fate with a nod. "All right, but I want one thing in return." "What?" "Truth," Silvio said. "I need to know who's at the top, who's pulling the strings." Tellez exhaled smoke, stared into the horizon for a long time, and then whispered a name. Not loud, not triumphant, just a single syllable that cracked the facade of everything Silvio thought he understood about the region's power structure. A name that didn't belong in cartel ledgers or rebel logs, but in the halls of diplomatic summits and trade negotiations. A name Silvio had once shaken hands with. "You're lying," Silvio said. "I wish I were," Tellez replied. Moments later, 2 sharp pops echoed from a building across the river. Silvio dove low as glass shattered around them. Tellez slumped forward, blood blooming from his chest in widening circles. A third shot hit the chair where Silvio's head had been seconds earlier. With no time to think, he dragged Tellez's body to the ground, pressed low, and waited for the firing to stop. The rooftop was empty by the time he peeked over the railing. The shooter had vanished. Likely had a spot or two. Tellez was still alive, but barely. Blood bubbled at his lips, his eyes wild with the sting of betrayal and time running short. He grabbed Silvio's sleeve, pulling him close. "They'll come for you now," he rasped. "Don't trust." His last word was swallowed by a death rattle, his grip slackening. Silvio stared at the man for a long second, then wiped the blood from his hands and disappeared into the night, the flash drive burning against his chest like a curse. Back in Lima, he changed identities twice before boarding a bus to Arequipa. From there, he would move north, staying off-grid, checking into rooms under borrowed names and slipping out before dawn. Every night, he backed up the flash drive. Every morning, he watched the news for reports of a body found on a rooftop. But there was nothing. No mention of Tellez. No police reports. It was as if the man had never existed. Dahlia and Mateo contacted him again, this time more urgently. They wanted the drive. They said it was theirs. That Tellez had stolen it from their organization. But Silvio had seen the look in Tellez's eyes. That wasn't the face of a thief. It was the face of a man running from devils dressed like diplomats. He didn't trust them. He didn't trust anyone. Weeks passed, and then one night, in a crumbling internet cafe in Chiclayo, Silvio decrypted the final section of the drive. What he found made him sick. It wasn't just names, it was transactions, evidence, detailed documentation of state-sponsored protection agreements, foreign banks laundering bribes through shell NGOs, and private security contractors used as death squads in rural municipalities. It was the blueprint of a continent's shadow economy, and it implicated men and women Silvio had once thought untouchable. He had a choice now: sell the drive and disappear, or leak it and start a fire no government could contain. But either way, he knew this. There was no going back. He wasn't a broker anymore. He wasn't neutral. He was a threat. And in South America, 2007, threats didn't live long. Silvio disappeared that year. Some say he took the drive to the U.S. Embassy and cut a deal. Others say he died in Bolivia under a false name, shot twice in the back of the head. But in a barrio near Bogota, there's a story told by old smugglers that if you whisper the right name in the right alleyway, a man will appear with a memory stick, and for a price, he'll show you the truth behind the curtain. Not because he wants to, but because he can't forget. Let's jump to next story. Story 5. South America, 2006, The Bones of Caracas. The air in Caracas was heavy with the scent of burning oil and tropical rot, a sour mixture that clung to the skin and curled inside your lungs like a parasite. In the barrios stacked like broken teeth across the hillsides, boys with pistols tucked into their belts played at being kings, while the real lords of the city watched from behind tinted glass, sipping aged rum and listening to Bach over the quiet hum of air conditioning. It was a city teetering between the bones of revolution and the skeleton of a new empire, one built not on ideals, but on cocaine, silence, and blood. Diego Escalona knew this intimately, not because he wanted to, but because he had helped build part of that empire. And now, after 5 years in the shadows, someone had begun digging up his past. At 39, Diego was a ghost wrapped in flesh. His last assignment had been in 2001, a job in Maracaibo that ended with a dead prosecutor, a rigged boat explosion, and a bullet in his thigh that still ached when the rain came. Since then, he'd vanished from the inner circles, living quietly under a different name in the coastal town of Cumana. He taught English at a small private school, smoked filterless cigarettes on the roof of his apartment, and only glanced at newspapers when he was certain they carried nothing about his old life. But the knock came anyway, 3 taps at midnight, sharp and deliberate like a code. She was waiting in the hallway when he opened the door, a woman in her early 30s with short hair, a scar over one eyebrow, and the posture of someone who had never trusted chairs. Her name was Rosa Pena, and Diego knew that name the moment she said it, because he had heard it before, in a taped phone call back in 1999, when her brother Miguel had been picked up by the Sebin and never seen again. She looked like she hadn't forgotten. "You used to work for General Vargas," she said, her voice flat but dangerous. "I need something that was taken from my brother." Diego studied her for a long moment. Behind her eyes, he saw the weight of years without answers. Rage chiseled down into discipline. She wasn't here to beg or plead. She was here to make him choose. "I haven't spoken to Vargas in 5 years," he said, "and I don't have anything that belonged to Miguel." "Don't lie to me," Rosa said, stepping forward. "You delivered the files to the extraction site in La Victoria. You gave the green light. I have documents." That last word, documents, hit harder than any threat. Diego stepped back, letting her into the small apartment, and shut the door quietly. "If what you say is true," he said, "you shouldn't be here. Anyone watching me would already know your name now." "I've been watched before," she replied. "But they're not watching you anymore, Diego. You've been retired too long. They think you're harmless." Diego poured them each a glass of stale water and sat across from her at the small kitchen table, lit by a buzzing fluorescent bulb. The fan rattled in the corner, stirring the heat just enough to remind them both how alive they still were. "I knew your brother," Diego said finally. "He wasn't a soldier. He was a courier. He passed messages between opposition groups and foreign journalists. The regime hated him because he was clean. They couldn't bribe him, and they couldn't scare him. But they didn't kill him. At least not right away." Rosa's jaw clenched, but she didn't interrupt. Diego continued. "There was an operation, Operation New Broja. The official target was an arms cache north of Barinas. But it was a cover. What they really wanted was the list Miguel carried. Names of police officers working with the Inter-American Commission, leaking proof of extrajudicial killings. Vargas ordered me to retrieve it. I intercepted the drop and destroyed it before he ever saw it. Why? Because I knew what he'd do with it, and because your brother was brave in a way I never was. Rosa leaned back, folding her arms. So what happened to him? They kept him in a black site called El Huso, the Bone. It was never official. A ghost prison built into a collapsed mining tunnel outside Merida. No light, no air, only prisoners they didn't want to admit existed. I tried to get him out. Once. Paid off a captain to fake a transfer. But someone talked, and the whole thing fell apart. I barely made it out alive. Miguel didn't. The silence that followed was vast. Outside, a siren wailed and faded. Rosa took a slow breath, then opened the folder she'd brought with her and slid a photo across the table. It was grainy but unmistakable. A mass grave, half-buried bones, rusted shackles, and one identifiable tattoo still clinging to a forearm. "We found it 2 weeks ago," she said. "The bone. Or what's left of it." The rains collapsed most of the tunnel, but there were 17 bodies, all of them still wearing prisoner tags. No records, no reports, nothing, just numbers etched in metal. Diego stared at the image. There it was, the past clawing its way back through the dirt. He didn't speak. "There's more," Rosa said. "Files. Not many, but enough. Copies. Names. Coordinators. Flight paths for black transports. Some of them lead to Colombia, others to Guyana, but one name shows up in all of them." She paused, watching his reaction. "Yours." Diego exhaled slowly. It wasn't a shock. He had known for years that if anyone ever unearthed those sites, he'd be tied to them. Even if he hadn't pulled the trigger, even if he hadn't written the orders, he had facilitated the silence. He had smoothed the path. That was the real crime. "I don't have a way out," Rosa said, "but I have enough to make noise. I can't undo what happened to Miguel, but I can make them bleed. I just need someone who knows how to finish what I started." "You're asking me to burn everything," Diego said. "I'm asking you to do one last job, for someone who never got a second chance." Diego looked out the window. Across the rooftops, he saw the flicker of a helicopter sweeping low over the city, a dark shape moving through darker air. Below, a car engine backfired, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked at the thunder rolling in over the sea. He drained his glass, stood slowly, and retrieved a locked case from under the floorboards. Inside were the tools of a man who no longer existed, passports, weapons, codes. He closed the lid. "Then let's start digging," he said. They left Cumana before dawn, riding in the cramped cabin of an aging Renault that wheezed against the winding curves of the Venezuelan interior like an asthmatic soldier returning to the battlefield. Diego drove while Rosa navigated, though their destination, Merida, was less a place on a map and more a memory reconstructed from whispers and inference. El Huso had been designed to vanish, nestled between state-owned mining operations and shielded by military jurisdiction. Even in 2006, when government secrecy blurred into farce and revolution was commodified into T-shirts, places like the Bone remained immune to public scrutiny. But Diego remembered the way, and so did the scars on his leg. The road twisted like guilt, each turn ushering them closer to the corpse of the past they both had come to exhume. Merida greeted them with gray clouds and the sour scent of old diesel. They checked into a no-name inn that doubled as a brothel after dark, where the desk clerk didn't ask questions, and the rooms came with padlocks on the inside. Rosa spread out her files across the bed, her fingers tapping nervously at each page. Names, codes, maps. Diego stared at one of the older documents, typed in 10-point font on weathered paper, marked with a faint watermark he recognized. A Sebin archive seal, long discontinued. These weren't fakes. Someone had risked everything to leak these, and that meant the trail was still hot. That night, Diego left Rosa at the inn and walked to a payphone 3 blocks away. He dialed an old frequency, one that hadn't been active since 2003, and let it ring 6 times before hanging up. 3 hours later, as the city's power grid flickered under the strain of the summer heat, he met a man named Esteban near the old cable car depot. Esteban had once been a field operative under Vargas, a logistics ghost who specialized in moving unmarked cargo across borders. Now he worked freelance, helping journalists smuggle footage out of the jungle or selling routes to traffickers who didn't ask where the blood came from. Esteban looked older, gaunt, and wore mirrored sunglasses at night like a man trying to forget what eyes were for. "You're supposed to be dead," Esteban said, lighting a cigarette. Maybe I am, Diego replied. I need to find what's left of the bone. Esteban stiffened. That place collapsed years ago. If you're lucky, all you'll find is rubble. If I'm unlucky, you'll find the ones still guarding it. Diego handed over a stack of Bolivares and a bottle of Havana Club. Esteban hesitated, then scratched a set of coordinates onto a matchbook and shoved it into Diego's hand. They moved the access tunnel, he said. It's not under the mine anymore. Look for a culvert behind the hydro station, red pipe, half buried. But listen, don't go in there alone. And if you hear humming, leave. That's the generators. If they're still running, someone's inside. Diego nodded and walked back through the sleeping city, the matchbook warm in his pocket, like a key that might open a door straight to hell. The next morning, they hiked into the hills. The air grew thin and electric, full of biting insects and the screeches of howler monkeys that seemed to mock their every step. By noon they found the culvert, choked with vines and mud, the red pipe just visible under a lattice of moss. Rosa went in first, flashlight gripped like a weapon. Diego followed, the walls closing in around them like a lung. The tunnel sloped downward, uneven and slick. After 100 meters, they found the first skeleton, shackled to the wall, arms still raised in eternal surrender. Rosa didn't flinch. She took a photo and moved on. They reached the central chamber 20 minutes later. It was partially collapsed, beams bent like broken fingers, ceiling torn open to the soil above. But what remained was unmistakable. 10 cells, each no bigger than a closet, bars rusted but intact. Diego walked the row slowly, his steps echoing off stone. Names were scratched into the walls in fingernail gouges. Carlos Martin, L. 027. Then Rosa stopped in front of one cell and pointed. There, under a layer of soot and mildew, was a name carved deeper than the rest. Miguel Pena. Diego swallowed hard. Rosa stood motionless, her hand touching the letters like they might still be warm. She knelt, brushing aside rubble. Underneath, wrapped in what was once a tarp, lay a case. Metal. Locked. Diego used a rock to break it open. Inside, documents. Photos. Lists of prisoner IDs and transfer orders, including one marked with his own call sign. Operation New Broja. Confirmation. Damnation. We have enough, Rosa said, voice steady. This proves the site existed. This proves what they did here. Diego didn't answer. Something was wrong. Too easy. Too preserved. If this had been untouched for years, why was the case barely rusted? He scanned the ceiling. The soil wasn't just loose, it was freshly disturbed. Then he heard it, a faint hum, distant but rising. The generators, he whispered. They ran, stumbling through the tunnel, lungs burning. Behind them, a low growl began, followed by shouting, Spanish voices, commands, boots on stone. Armed men, closing fast. Diego shoved Rosa ahead and pulled his pistol, the old Beretta he'd carried through 2 coups and 5 regimes. He fired once into the dark, buying seconds. Light flared behind them, flashlights, maybe muzzle flashes. They burst into the open, just as gunfire erupted. Rosa dove into the underbrush. Diego rolled, fired twice more. A scream. Then silence. They crawled a half-kilometer uphill and hid in the brush until nightfall. When they finally emerged, bruised and exhausted, Rosa turned to him. You knew they'd still be watching. I hoped they'd forgotten, he said, coughing. But someone wanted us to find that case. They wanted us to take it and run. Why? To smoke us out. They made it back to Merida and disappeared by morning, burning the files to digital and scattering backups across a network of safe contacts. Rosa booked flights to Argentina under forged papers. Diego stayed behind, watching from the shadows as police reports misclassified the firefight as a gang dispute, and the bone was sealed again, this time under the cover of a landslide. But the truth was no longer buried. The documents had already reached Bogota, then Santiago. Within weeks, whispers would become headlines. As Diego lit a cigarette on the roof of a boarding house in San Cristobal, he wondered whether redemption was just another form of penance. He hadn't saved Miguel. He hadn't stopped the machine. But he had cracked its bones, and perhaps that was enough. Far off, thunder rolled across the Andes, and somewhere in the dark, Rosa Pena's voice was rising. Loud, unflinching. The dead were speaking at last. Let's jump to next story. Story 6. The Crows of Parody. South America, 2005. In the humid cradle of the Atlantic forest, nestled between moss-covered cliffs and the ancient, uneven cobblestones of the Brazilian coast, Parody had always worn 2 faces. one a mask of tourist charm, the other a scarred relic of smuggler routes and imperial greed. By 2005, the old port city still carried the echoes of those dual legacies. Cargo boats crept through its fog like ghosts returning home, the docks watched by seagulls and crooked-eyed men with radios in their belts and pistols in their socks. It was in this place, beneath skies split by jagged thunder and moonlight soaked in sea mist, that the body of federal agent Leandro Maciel washed ashore, shoeless, his ribs broken in 3 places, and a crow feather stitched into his jacket pocket like a signature. Detective Cassio Duarte had not planned to return to Parody. He had grown up in those back alleys, had run his fingers along the barnacled hulls of sugar barges, and listened to his uncle's tales of pirate ghosts and hidden vaults under the cathedral's altar. He had left at 17 after his older brother was stabbed in the eye during a street poker game, and now, at 42, after a decade in the Rio Civil Police's anti-narcotics unit, he had been sent back, unwilling, unshaven, and already nursing the ghosts of the past. But Maciel's death couldn't be left to the locals. Not with that feather, not with what it meant. The Corvos Negros, the Black Crows, weren't just a cartel. They were folklore made flesh, a multi-generational operation with roots in colonial smuggling, their members bloodbound by lineage, cruelty, and silence. They moved everything from morphine to diamonds through forgotten jungle trails and submerged tunnels carved by enslaved men 2 centuries ago. Nobody infiltrated the Crows. Nobody left alive once their name was carved into the register. And that feather, sewn beneath the lining of Maciel's coat, was more than a calling card. It was a promise. Speak and rot. Cassio stood on the pier, staring out at the gray dawn. Rain tapped gently at his shoulders. Behind him, forensic officers zipped up Maciel's remains and lifted the body onto a stretcher. The tide was pulling back now, dragging secrets out to sea. A boy in a torn Flamengo jersey watched from the alley, chewing a piece of sugar cane, eyes wide with the knowledge of someone who had seen too much. Cassio lit a cigarette and didn't turn around. By midday, he had commandeered a room above the old bar near the Church of Santa Rita. Its walls were stained with rum and history, the kind of place where secrets hid behind every cracked tile. He opened Maciel's case files, but they were sparse, deliberately so. Redacted communiques. Satellite photos of jungle clearings. Names half blacked out. R. Vieira, Silva P. Mateo? A napkin fell out from between the pages. Written in shaky cursive, meet at the market. Ask for Inez. Cassio didn't like games. But this wasn't a game. It was a slow ritual, one he'd seen play out in other cities, other murders. Maciel hadn't just been killed. He had been offered, a warning to anyone snooping too close to the smuggling veins pumping through the rainforest. That feather, it was always sewn by the eldest of the Crows. Legend said she used a needle carved from bone and a thread soaked in blood and sea water. A story, maybe. But in Brazil, stories had a way of coming true. At dusk, he walked to the market, a crumbling maze of fish stalls, tobacco carts, and suspiciously fresh electronics. The air smelled of salt, sweat, and spilled cachaca. He found her by the spice table. Mid-60s, veiled in widow's black, with cataract-glazed eyes and a mouth set in defiance. She was skin and shadows, but when she spoke, her voice had iron in it. "You're looking for a ghost," she said before he could speak. "But ghosts don't leave trails." "Inez?" he asked. She nodded. Maciel came 3 weeks ago. Said he was hunting devils. Said he found one in the form of a priest. A priest? She tapped the table twice, then handed him a bag of dried cloves. He lives in the house behind the third chapel. Does not preach. Does not pray. But once a week, 5 men with briefcases visit him. They bring him bottles of red wine. They leave without them. "What's in the wine?" She shrugged. "Ghosts, maybe." He slipped her a folded note. "If anything happens to me, give this to a man named Errance in Rio." She didn't look at it. "I buried my husband because of the Crows," she said. "I won't bury another man I never kissed. Go, and don't come back here unless the ground is shaking." Cassio waited until nightfall. He didn't knock on the priest's door. He watched. From a rooftop. 2 hours passed, and then the visitors arrived, sharp suits, snakeskin shoes, one of them with a scar shaped like a horseshoe on his neck. They carried nothing. They left with 2 wooden crates and a bag marked liturgical supplies. By the time they were gone, the priest was on his back porch, smoking. He wasn't dressed like a priest. He wore a flannel shirt and old jeans. But his face was wrong. Too smooth. No lines. No age. eyes like something that lived underground. Cassio moved closer, crossed the alley, climbed the rear wall like he had when he was a child, fleeing beat cops and angry shopkeepers. He was behind the man now, pistol drawn, wind rising, crows circling overhead. "I know what you are," Cassio said. The priest didn't flinch. He just smiled. "And I know what's buried beneath the altar at Santa Rita." At those words, the priest stood. Not fast, not slow, just, inevitably. "Then I guess we'll both be ghosts by morning." The rain came hard after midnight, not the usual drizzle that kissed the cobblestones of Parody, but a downpour that fell with the fury of forgotten saints. Lightning carved blue veins into the sky as thunder rolled over the tiled roofs and rusted gutters. Inside the priest's compound, Cassio stood beneath the hanging laundry line, gun leveled at the man who called himself Father Celso. But there was no tremble in Celso's voice, no beads of panic on his brow. He spoke like a man who had already accepted his place in hell and had memorized its architecture. "You think this ends with me, officer?" he said, voice low. "You kill me, and you awaken 3 more. That is how the crows survive, through blood, inheritance, and the silence of rivers." Cassio stepped closer, boots sinking into the mud. "Then tell me who follows you. Tell me who killed Maciel." Celso moved his hand slightly, toward a table where a bottle of cachaca waited beside a rusted oil lantern. Cassio's finger tensed on the trigger, but the man only poured himself a drink, calm as ritual. Maciel was foolish. He opened a tunnel that had not been opened in 70 years. Beneath the Santa Rita altar, where they once hid gold from the Portuguese crown. He found it. He mapped it. He planned to burn it down. But there are things under the chapel older than our nation, detective. Older than your badge. He drank. The liquid sloshed against his lips, and for a brief second, the shadows seemed to dance across his face in unnatural ways. "We buried him in the tide, but it was the forest that killed him." Cassio's hands were shaking now. He had faced men who skinned traitors, men who dissolved rivals in acid. He had raided favelas at midnight, dodging bullets and shouts. But this was something else. This was myth come alive in cracked tiles and holy robes. He didn't lower his gun, but neither did he fire. "You're going to walk with me," he said. "Now. And you're going to open the vault beneath that church." Celso chuckled. "You still believe vaults and smuggling routes are all this is?" "No. The crows are more than cargo and coin. We protect what lies below. You won't understand until you see it. But I will take you, out of respect." The walk through the empty streets was silent save for the chorus of crows above and the constant hush of falling water. They moved through alleyways slick with moss and across footbridges where lovers once whispered, and now only the wind spoke. The church of Santa Rita loomed at the edge of the harbor, yellow-walled and cross-topped, its front door chained shut. Celso produced a key from his belt and unlocked it slowly, the rusted chains clanking like the rattles of old ghosts. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and rot. Broken pews lined the nave, and a cracked statue of Saint Rita stared down from the apse, her face chipped and weeping stone tears. "Down here," Celso said, pulling a torch from the wall and lighting it with a match. They descended a narrow staircase behind the pulpit, spiraling into the earth where the air grew colder, damper, older. The walls were carved stone, laced with old Portuguese script and symbols Cassio didn't recognize. The stench of salt and something fouler, decay perhaps, grew thicker with each step. Then the staircase opened into a chamber, its ceiling low and ribbed like a beast's belly. Crows perched on ledges, silent but watching. In the center of the room stood a stone slab, and beneath it, an iron hatch, sealed with 7 locks. Celso knelt before it. Maciel picked the first 3. He never made it past the 4th. The voices got to him. Cassio swallowed hard. "Voices? You'll hear them too," Celso whispered, unlocking the first. "They don't speak in words. They offer you futures, a different life, power, a way to vanish. I'm not here to vanish. No, but by dawn you may wish you had." As Celso opened the 6th lock, the room seemed to hum, like a current passed beneath the stones, vibrating the soles of Cassio's boots. He smelled burning wood. He heard the faintest sound of waves crashing on some unseen shore. Then the final lock fell away, and the hatch creaked open, revealing a ladder descending into darkness. Celso handed him the torch. "Go. See what Maciel saw." Cassio stared at him for a long moment, then climbed down. The ladder led to a narrow tunnel, water seeping from the ceiling and pooling at his feet. The walls were lined with skulls, hundreds, maybe thousands, some with scratches still etched across the bone. He moved forward, each step echoing like a footstep in a tomb. Then he saw it, a chamber lit by a single skylight from above, where moonlight shone on crates of weapons, stacks of currency from 5 nations, and in the center, a wooden table on which lay photographs. Dozens of them, all black and white. All of him. Photos of Cassio as a child, playing in the port. As a teen, running from a police patrol. As a young officer in Rio, standing over the corpse of his first bust. His hands trembled. These weren't fakes. These were real. Stolen from time. "What the hell is this?" he whispered, stepping back. But he stepped on something soft. He looked down. A feather. Black. Fresh. The room trembled, and he heard it then, the voice Celso spoke of. Not in his ear, but inside his mind. It offered no words, only images. Cassio at the head of the crows. Cassio turning his badge in, commanding respect through fear. Cassio with power no law could touch. He stumbled back, but the tunnel behind him was gone. The ladder had vanished. He was alone. Or so he thought. From the darkness came a whisper. A voice he knew. "Leandro," he called out. The federal agent stepped into the light, his face pale, stitched. But he smiled. "You see now, don't you?" Cassio screamed, but no sound came. The crows above the city cried out as the moon vanished behind thunderclouds. And somewhere in the chapel above, Celso lit a candle and whispered a prayer not in Portuguese, not in Latin, but in a tongue that hadn't been spoken in over 1,000 years. Let's jump to next story. Story 7. The Shadow of Rio. South America, 2004. The night was too quiet for Rio de Janeiro. The usual hum of the favelas, the rhythmic thumping of samba music echoing from crumbling homes, was absent, replaced by the deep silence that only comes before something terrible. On the rooftop of a building in the heart of the city's most notorious slum, Inspector Rafael Costa stood, his hands gripping the edge as he stared out across the city. Below him, the lights of Rio flickered like stars, but the real darkness was above, hidden in the shadows that clung to the alleyways and sewers where no one dared to tread. Costa wasn't looking at the city, though. His eyes were focused on something far more dangerous, a crime that threatened to tear the fragile fabric of Rio apart. Costa had seen death before. The endless cycle of murder and mayhem that churned through the streets of Rio was part of the job. But this felt different. The recent string of murders was too calculated, too precise. It wasn't just gang violence. It wasn't random. Someone with a plan was at work, and Costa knew that whatever the plan was, it would bring ruin to more than just the victims. The first body had been found 2 weeks ago, a young woman, barely 20, left in an alley in the favela of Rocinha. Her throat had been slit, but that wasn't what made the case strange. It was the way she was positioned, her arms outstretched, her body arranged like a sacrificial offering. No one had seen anything. No one knew who did it. Then, a week later, another body was found, this time in the poorer district of Santa Teresa. The victim was male, a drug dealer by the looks of him, but once again, the position of the body was the same. Arms outstretched, a gruesome message hidden within the pose. Costa had been running through every theory in his head. A serial killer? Perhaps. But the method was too similar. There was a pattern, a message embedded in the ritualistic deaths. Was this the work of a single person, or was it part of something larger? Costa's instincts told him that whoever was behind this wasn't just a criminal. They were someone with power, someone who could make people disappear without a trace, and someone with connections far beyond the reach of the police. His gut twisted as he thought about the possible players in this deadly game. The favelas were ruled by gangs, each with their own territory, their own rules. But this wasn't gang-related. This was something more sinister, something darker. His phone vibrated in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. Costa pulled it out and read the message from his partner, João Silva. Another one. Same spot. Same ritual. Costa cursed under his breath. Another victim. It seemed like the killer was getting bolder. The body had been found in a quiet alley near the foot of the hill, not far from where Costa stood now. He could almost feel the darkness pressing in on him, as if the killer was watching from the shadows, waiting for him to make a move. Costa turned and made his way down to the street, his heart pounding in his chest. The humid air hit him like a wall as he stepped into the chaos of the favela. The narrow streets were lined with rundown houses, their roofs patched together with whatever materials people could find. The scent of grilled meat and garbage wafted through the air, mixing with the salty tang of the ocean in the distance. He could hear the faint echoes of distant laughter and shouting, but there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. People seemed to be avoiding eye contact, their gazes darting around as if they feared being caught in something they didn't understand. Costa reached the alley where the latest body had been discovered. The scene was cordoned off by yellow police tape, and several officers were standing around, speaking in hushed tones. The body had already been covered by a white sheet, but Costa could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. The same ritual, the same eerie silence that followed the discovery of each victim. Whoever was doing this was sending a message, and Costa couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to be the recipient of that message. He kneeled beside the body, lifting the sheet carefully. The victim was a man this time, his face twisted in a grotesque grimace, his eyes wide open in terror. Costa's breath caught in his throat as he saw the position of the body. Arms outstretched, just like the others. He looked down at the victim's hands. There was something clenched tightly in his grip, something that hadn't been there before. A small, folded piece of paper. Costa carefully took the paper from the victim's hand, unfolding it with trembling fingers. The message was brief, but it made his blood run cold. The last is coming. The crows will feast. It was written in a jagged hand, the ink smudged as if the writer had been trembling. Costa stared at the words for a moment, trying to make sense of them. What did it mean? The crows, was this some sort of code? A reference to the gangs that ran the streets? Or was it something else entirely? Costa! Joao's voice broke through his thoughts. You okay? Costa didn't answer immediately. His mind was racing. This wasn't just a killer leaving bodies in the streets. It was a warning. But a warning for whom? And who was sending it? We need to get this to forensics, Joao continued. We can't let this slip. Costa stood slowly, his eyes still fixed on the paper. He was already thinking ahead, calculating the next steps in his investigation. Whoever was behind this had a plan, and Costa had to stop them before they could complete it. But he knew one thing for sure. The killer wasn't just playing with death, he was playing with fate. And fate, in Rio de Janeiro, had a way of coming for those who thought they could control it. The following day was no less oppressive. The air hung thick, like a cloak of heat that refused to lift, and the sun blazed mercilessly over the hills of Rio. Costa had barely slept the night before, his thoughts consumed by the cryptic message left with the last victim. The crows will feast. He kept replaying it in his mind, searching for meaning, as if the words themselves held some secret key to the case. But there were no answers, only more questions. By noon, Costa was back on the streets, his mind sharp and alert as he made his way through the favela once again. The noise of the city was deafening now, as if everyone in Rio had decided that the day's heat was worth ignoring. Vendors shouted in the streets, selling everything from cheap sunglasses to bottles of water, their voices blending into a cacophony of sound that seemed to blur into one. Children ran between the legs of adults, their laughter echoing through the narrow alleys. But none of this reassured Costa. He knew something darker was lurking just beneath the surface. He met up with Joao outside a small, unmarked warehouse near the docks, an area often frequented by criminals looking to make quick deals. The warehouse was a shell of its former self, long abandoned by legitimate business owners and left to rot in the humidity. It was the perfect place for criminals to operate, and Costa had no doubt that the person behind the killings had ties to places like this. The question was, how could he connect the dots? Any new developments? Costa asked as Joao approached, his face tired but focused. Joao handed him a thick file, the pages filled with the usual reports and forensic data. But one photograph caught Costa's attention. It was a picture of the body from yesterday, the one found in the alley. More specifically, it was a close-up of the victim's hand, the one that had held the piece of paper. Costa's heart skipped a beat as he looked at the small symbol etched into the victim's palm, a crow. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. He had seen that symbol before. It was a marker of sorts, something used by one of the most notorious criminal syndicates operating in the region, the Black Ravens. Black Ravens, Joao muttered, as if reading Costa's thoughts. They've been quiet for a while, but I've heard rumors they've been making moves behind the scenes. Costa nodded grimly. The Black Ravens were an underground network of criminals involved in everything from drug trafficking to money laundering. They were known for their ruthlessness, their ability to eliminate anyone who got in their way. Costa had crossed paths with them more than once during his career, but he had never seen them act with such precision. Whoever was pulling the strings behind these murders had to be a part of this organization, or at least someone connected to it. We need to dig deeper into the Black Ravens, Costa said, his voice low. Find out who's still operating in the area. Someone's been sending a message, and I think they're trying to send us a warning. The last victim, the crows will feast. That's no coincidence. Joao nodded, his eyes narrowing as he processed the information. You think this is some kind of initiation or punishment? A warning to others? I don't know, Costa replied, but I'm certain the ravens are involved. And if we don't move fast, the next victim might be someone we know. The two of them spent the rest of the afternoon combing through old intelligence reports and surveillance footage, trying to find anything that could lead them to the killer. The deeper they went, the more they uncovered. The Black Ravens weren't just involved in petty street crime. They had their hands in everything. And that made them dangerous, even more so now that they seemed to be sending out these cryptic messages. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the streets of Rio, Costa received an unexpected call. It was from his informant, a small-time dealer named Rodrigo, who had once given him information about a major drug shipment that had been intercepted by the police. Rodrigo was nervous on the phone, his voice trembling. "Inspector Costa, you need to come quick. There's something happening at the old warehouse near Lapa. I don't know what it is, but it's bad. The Ravens, they're meeting tonight. I've seen them. They're armed and ready." Costa's heart raced as he looked at Joao. "We need to move. Now." The two of them raced through the streets, making their way toward Lapa, a neighborhood known for its vibrant nightlife and cultural significance. But as Costa approached the warehouse, he felt a chill creep up his spine. Something was off. The streets were eerily quiet, and the usual noise from the nearby bars and restaurants seemed distant, muffled by the oppressive weight of the night. They reached the warehouse, their footsteps barely making a sound as they crept closer. Costa could see the dim light coming from inside, flickering through the cracked windows. He motioned for Joao to follow as they made their way to the back of the building, where they could hear the faint hum of voices. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and Costa froze. A figure emerged from the shadows, cloaked in a long black coat. The figure's face was obscured by a mask, but the symbol of the Black Ravens was unmistakable. A crow, etched into the fabric of the coat. "It's him," Costa whispered, his voice tight with anger. "The one behind it all." As they prepared to make their move, Costa's mind raced. This wasn't just about stopping the murders. It was about taking down an entire network, a criminal syndicate that had held Rio in its grip for far too long. But as the figure turned and stepped into the darkness, Costa realized something else. The hunt was far from over. It had only just begun. Let's jump to next story. Story 8. Shadows of the Andes. South America, 2003. The rain had been relentless that evening, drenching the narrow streets of the small town of La Paz, a place where the air was thick with the promise of something far more sinister than the usual downpour. Inspector Gabriel Costa had seen his fair share of rainstorms in his career, but there was something different about this one. The heavy drops pounded the cracked pavement as if they were a harbinger, marking the beginning of something much darker. For the last few weeks, Costa had been tracking a series of increasingly brutal killings that had rocked the quiet Andean town. There was a peculiar sense of tension in the air, and Costa knew, he could feel it deep in his bones, that this storm wasn't the only storm brewing. His office, tucked in the corner of the police station, had become his second home. The walls were lined with case files, photographs of missing persons, unsolved homicides, and the occasional map of the town. Yet, there was a sense of futility in the sterile environment, as though no matter how much he worked, the violence surrounding him would never end. Costa had seen it all in the years he had been on the force, the corruption, the hopelessness, the poverty that gnawed at the very soul of La Paz. But this latest case was different. There was a whisper that the killings were not random. They were carefully orchestrated, each victim selected with a specific purpose in mind. The latest victim, a young woman named Carmen, had been found just outside the town, her body left in the ruins of an old church. Her eyes were wide open, staring into the night as if she had seen something that no one else could. Costa's team had combed through the area for hours, but there were no clues, no signs of a struggle, only the eerie silence of the church's crumbling walls. And the mark, that strange, almost ritualistic mark carved into her palm. It was this mark that had troubled Costa the most. It wasn't like anything he had ever seen before, an intricate symbol, a blend of curving lines that formed something almost resembling a bird's wing. Whoever had left it was making a statement that Costa could not yet decipher, but one that would reveal itself in time, he was certain of it. The investigation had turned up little. The townsfolk were too terrified to speak, their loyalty to the local drug cartels far stronger than any sense of civic duty. Costa had tried to reach out to his informants, but they were all quiet, like the rest of La Paz. No one wanted to draw attention to themselves. But that night, as he sat in his office, staring at the cold rain outside, he knew the investigation would take a dangerous turn. Something bigger was at play, and the murder of Carmen was just the beginning. It wasn't long before Costa's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps outside his door. He looked up to see his partner, Maria Hernandez, entering the room. Her face was drawn with exhaustion, the lines beneath her eyes deepened by the stress of the case. They had been working together for years, and in that time, Costa had come to trust her instincts as much as his own. If Maria had something on her mind, he knew it was worth listening to. "Gabriel," she said, her voice low, "you need to see this." She handed him a thick folder, its edges worn from constant handling. Costa glanced at her and then opened the file. Inside were photographs, pictures of Carmen taken after the autopsy. But it wasn't the photographs of the victim that caught his attention. It was the one photograph tucked in between the others. A grainy image, barely visible, showing a man standing in the shadows of a street corner. His face was obscured, but the black jacket he wore had the same symbol as the one found on Carmen's palm. Costa's pulse quickened. This was the lead they had been waiting for. Where did this come from? Costa asked, his voice tense. "Surveillance footage from the corner of Calle 7 and Libertad," Maria replied. "It was recorded around the time Carmen disappeared. The man in the photo was there, standing by the alley. I don't think it's a coincidence." Costa leaned back in his chair, staring at the image. The man was cloaked in shadow, his movements too deliberate to be a passerby. He had been waiting for something, or someone. Costa knew then that the case was about to take him deeper into a world of corruption, secrecy, and betrayal. This man was connected to something far darker than any of them had anticipated. "I need to find him," Costa muttered, more to himself than to Maria. "I know," Maria replied, "but we need to be careful. This isn't just a random killing spree. There's a pattern. Carmen was the fourth victim in the last month, and the symbol, it's not just for show." Costa didn't need her to elaborate. He had seen enough to know that the symbol was a sign, a marker left behind by someone who was sending a message. And Costa had a sinking feeling that the man in the photograph was at the center of it all. "I'll get the team on it," Costa said, his voice hardening. "We'll follow up on this lead. But we need to move quickly before they disappear again." Maria nodded, her expression unreadable. "What do you think the symbol means?" Costa paused for a moment, staring at the image again. "I don't know yet, but I've seen it before. Not here, but in other towns across the region. It's a mark used by a secret society, one that operates in the shadows. Their presence has always been denied by local authorities, but I'm convinced they're involved." Maria looked at him, her eyes narrowing. "The Brotherhood?" Costa gave a short nod. The Brotherhood was an old, secretive group with deep roots in South America's criminal underworld. Its origins were lost in history, but rumors swirled about its involvement in everything from political corruption to drug trafficking. Over the years, Costa had dismissed the Brotherhood as just another myth, another tale told to frighten children. But now, standing in front of him was proof that the myth was real, and deadly. "We need to find them before they find us," Costa said, his voice steely with resolve. As the rain continued to pour outside, Costa knew one thing for certain: the case was far from over. It had only just begun. The next morning, Costa stood at the edge of a crumbling bridge overlooking a murky river that wound its way through the outskirts of La Paz. The town had an eerie stillness to it in the early hours. Most of the locals were still asleep, but the weight of the investigation pressed heavily on Costa's chest. The map on his desk was still spread out at the station, showing connections between the victims, but the lines that linked them were still blurry. What started as a string of random, brutal murders now seemed to have an unseen hand behind them, one that was pulling the strings from the shadows. As Costa paced the narrow bridge, he thought back to the night he'd spent in his office, poring over the files. The deaths were too calculated, too deliberate to be the work of a single man or random criminals. There was a pattern, but it wasn't immediately obvious. Each of the victims had been chosen for a reason, and each had a link to something darker, a hidden undercurrent in the town's history that only a few knew about. Maria's words echoed in his mind. The Brotherhood. The Brotherhood. The mere mention of the name sent a chill down his spine. They were a phantom, a myth, their existence denied by all official sources. They were said to have been dissolved years ago, but the whispers of their power and reach in the darkest corners of South America persisted. Costa knew the stories. Everyone in law enforcement did. They were an elite, secretive group whose influence stretched beyond the criminal world, touching the very core of politics, business, and culture. Their hand was in everything, and no one dared cross them. And now it seemed that the Brotherhood was back, and they were making their presence known. Costa's thoughts were interrupted when Maria approached, holding a file in her hands. She looked grim, her usual sense of resolve replaced by a quiet tension. He knew instantly that whatever she had to say wouldn't be good news. "They found something," she said, her voice steady but tinged with worry. "In the woods, just outside town." Costa's heart skipped a beat. The woods were known for their dark history, an old hangout for smugglers and criminals, a place where secrets were buried, both figuratively and literally. The townspeople avoided it, saying the place was cursed. If Maria was bringing up the woods, it meant something dangerous had been uncovered. "What did they find?" Costa asked, already fearing the answer. "Another body," Maria replied, her gaze fixed on the ground. "But this one's different. The symbol, it's been carved into his chest." Costa's stomach churned. The mark, the same symbol that had appeared on Carmen. He felt a surge of dread, and for the first time in years, he questioned everything he had known about the town. Was it possible that the Brotherhood had been operating here all along, silently controlling the underworld while everyone else turned a blind eye? They drove to the woods in silence, the heavy rain still falling around them. Costa's mind raced as they neared the site. If there was one thing he knew about the Brotherhood, it was their tendency to use public displays of violence to send a message. Whoever had been killed in the woods wasn't just another victim. They had been sacrificed. The path to the site was treacherous, the mud making it difficult to get any traction. They arrived at the clearing after what felt like an eternity, the trees looming like silent witnesses to the brutality that had taken place. The body was sprawled out, abandoned like a broken doll in the middle of the clearing. Costa's eyes immediately went to the chest, where the symbol had been carved so deeply that it had pierced the victim's skin. The marks were almost identical to those found on Carmen, but this time they were more pronounced, more desperate. Costa squatted down beside the body, examining the intricate patterns etched into the flesh. The symbol was a bird's wing, the same design seen in other towns across the region. It was unmistakable. The Brotherhood was closer than ever before. Maria crouched beside him, her expression unreadable. "What does it mean, Gabriel?" she asked softly. Costa didn't answer right away. He couldn't. He was thinking, trying to piece together the puzzle that had eluded him for so long. Why the symbol? Why this particular pattern? It was a ritual, that much was clear. But why now? What had changed in La Paz to bring the Brotherhood back into the open? Then it hit him. The answer was simple, almost too obvious. Power. The Brotherhood had been laying low for years, but they hadn't been forgotten. The mark was a signal, a warning to anyone who thought they could challenge their authority. Costa had thought he was investigating a series of unrelated murders, but now he realized the truth. The murders weren't just a form of terror, they were a declaration of war. He stood up, his mind clearer than it had been in weeks. "We're dealing with something much bigger than just a string of killings," he said, his voice firm. "This is about control, and someone in this town has decided they want it back." Maria looked at him, a flicker of understanding passing across her face. "Who?" she asked. Costa didn't answer. Instead, he turned his gaze back to the body, the rain falling heavily around them. The investigation had just shifted into dangerous territory. He knew they were up against something far more powerful than they had imagined. The Brotherhood had returned, and they would stop at nothing to reclaim what they had lost. The storm had not yet passed. Let's jump to next story. Story 9. The sun was beginning to set over the sprawling hills of southern Argentina, casting long shadows across the dirt roads that wound through the small town of San Luis. It had been an unremarkable day for most of the residents. Quiet, slow, the kind of day that made it easy to forget the darkness that lingered just beneath the surface of their peaceful town. But for Detective Gabriel Alvarez, it was the kind of day that would haunt him for years to come. Alvarez stood by his car, a hand resting on the hood, his eyes scanning the horizon. He'd been called to the scene of a gruesome crime earlier that morning, and the image of the victim had not yet left his mind. A local businessman, well known in the community, had been found dead in his office, his throat slit, blood pooled around him like a silent scream. It was an unmistakable message. A message that someone somewhere wanted to send. He'd been working as a detective in San Luis for over a decade, but in all his years, he had never encountered a case like this. The town was small, quiet, and insulated from the violence that plagued larger cities. Murders were rare, and when they did happen, they were often crimes of passion, unplanned, impulsive acts that could be explained away with little effort. This, however, felt different. This was deliberate. This was calculated. The office where the businessman had been killed was located in the heart of the town, surrounded by rows of crumbling colonial buildings and narrow streets that barely allowed 2 cars to pass at once. The air smelled of dust and decay, a reminder of the economic struggles that had plagued the region for years. The victim's name was Enrique Morales, a man who had made his fortune in agriculture, growing soybeans and corn on a vast stretch of land that stretched out into the rolling fields. He was a figure of authority in San Luis, someone whose wealth and influence reached into every corner of the town. His death was a blow, not only to his family but to the entire community. Alvarez had spent most of the afternoon going through Morales's office, but there was little to go on. Nothing seemed out of place, no sign of forced entry, no obvious motives. The killer had taken the time to make sure there was no evidence left behind. It was almost as if the victim had known his time was coming. The detectives in the office had been quick to suggest robbery as a motive, but Alvarez had dismissed that theory immediately. The desk was untouched, the safe locked and undisturbed. Whoever had done this had known exactly what they were doing. They had come for a specific reason, and they had left just as quickly. As he stood there, staring into the distance, Alvarez thought back to the conversation he'd had with Morales's wife, Isabel, earlier that day. She had been in shock, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with disbelief. She spoke in a soft voice, almost as if she were still trying to comprehend the reality of her husband's death. But when Alvarez had asked about anyone who might have wanted to harm him, she had been quick to mention one name, Ricardo Rivera. Ricardo Rivera was a man whose name Alvarez had heard more times than he cared to count. A former business associate of Morales's, Rivera had once been part of the team that helped turn Morales's agricultural empire into the success it was. But their relationship had soured years ago, when Morales had cut him out of the company, leaving him with nothing. The rumors surrounding Rivera were unsettling. Some said he had turned to illicit dealings to support his lifestyle, while others whispered that he had ties to organized crime in Buenos Aires. It was enough to make Alvarez pause. But as the shadows grew longer and the first stars began to twinkle in the sky, Alvarez felt a chill settle in his bones. He had been chasing ghosts for too long. In his mind, the pieces of the puzzle weren't fitting together. He needed answers. He needed to understand who was behind this, and why. Underscore 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 underscore. Alvarez spent the next few days chasing down leads, trying to piece together the story of Enrique Morales's life. The more he dug, the more complicated things seemed to become. The town of San Luis, for all its outward calm, was riddled with secrets, and Morales had been at the center of it all. From shady business deals to suspicious financial transactions, everything he had built seemed to be underpinned by lies. It wasn't long before Alvarez found himself at the edge of the small town, on the outskirts where the land turned to wilderness. It was there that he found the first real lead, a hidden cabin tucked away among the dense trees, where few people had ventured in years. The cabin belonged to none other than Ricardo Rivera. The place was isolated, surrounded by nothing but fields and the sounds of nature. No one had seen Rivera for weeks, and his absence had raised suspicion. But Alvarez had a feeling that the cabin would hold the answers he was looking for. He approached cautiously, his senses on high alert. There were no signs of movement, no indication that anyone was home. But Alvarez knew better than to trust appearances. He slowly circled the cabin, searching for any sign of activity. It was when he reached the back of the structure that he noticed something strange, a set of fresh tire tracks leading up to the rear door. The door creaked open as he nudged it with his shoulder, revealing a dimly lit interior. The air inside was thick with the scent of stale cigarette smoke and something else, something that sent a wave of unease through him. As he stepped inside, the floorboards groaned beneath his weight, and the shadows seemed to close in around him. The cabin was sparsely furnished, with little more than a table and a few chairs. But as Alvarez moved further into the room, his eyes were drawn to a small, locked chest resting in the corner. The chest was old, weathered, but it was the only thing in the room that seemed out of place. It had been carefully tucked away, hidden as though someone didn't want it to be found. Alvarez approached it slowly, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the silence. His hand hovered over the chest, unsure whether he should open it. But something told him that the truth lay inside, locked away just like the secrets of San Luis. He knelt down and forced the lock open with his knife, his heart pounding in his chest. What he found inside would change everything. Underscore 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 underscore. The contents of the chest were a collection of documents, records, photographs, and letters. But one item in particular caught Alvarez's eye, a photograph of Enrique Morales, standing beside Ricardo Rivera, both men smiling as though they were old friends. But the image was dated, taken only a few months before Morales' death. Something about the look on their faces seemed off, as if they were hiding something. And there, tucked in the corner of the photo, was a small, cryptic symbol, an emblem that Alvarez didn't recognize. It was the beginning of the end of the puzzle, but also the start of a deeper mystery. Alvarez's hand trembled slightly as he held the photograph up to the light, examining it closer. The symbol was subtle, almost hidden in plain sight, but it nagged at him, as if he'd seen it somewhere before. The emblem resembled something he'd encountered in his past, something tied to a shadowy figure who had long been a part of Argentina's criminal underworld. The connection between the photograph and the symbol was no coincidence. The more he thought about it, the more it became clear that Enrique Morales' death was not just about a business rivalry or a financial betrayal. It was about something much deeper and far more dangerous. Alvarez carefully placed the photograph back in the chest and began to sift through the rest of the contents. The letters, some written in a hurried hand, contained cryptic messages that hinted at a secret deal between Morales and Rivera, a deal that involved far more than just land or money. The letters spoke of shipments, of arrangements, and of a network that spanned beyond the borders of Argentina. It was a covert operation, something that involved smuggling and illegal transactions, all hidden behind the facade of legitimate business. His mind raced as he pieced together the information. Morales, the respectable businessman who everyone had admired, had been living a double life. He had become entangled with criminal organizations, involved in smuggling rare goods and facilitating the flow of illegal money through the southern parts of South America. And now someone wanted to make sure those secrets stayed buried, by silencing him for good. Alvarez stood up, his mind spinning with the implications of what he had just uncovered. The quiet town of San Luis had become a battleground, and its residents were unknowingly caught in the crossfire of a war that had been raging beneath the surface for years. And yet, he felt more than ever that he was only scratching the surface. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that Ricardo Rivera was not just a businessman scorned. He was a key player in a much larger game. The letter he had found in the chest hinted at a series of transactions with an international crime syndicate, something that was bigger than any one person. And the mysterious emblem on the photograph now had a meaning, one that pointed toward a shadowy organization with ties across the continent, an organization that Alvarez had been chasing for years without even realizing it. Alvarez's stomach tightened as he thought about the dangers he was now walking into. This was no longer just about solving a murder. It was about uncovering a criminal network that reached the highest echelons of society. It was about taking down people who had corrupted the very institutions meant to protect the innocent. He had always thought of himself as a protector of the people, but now he understood that the lines between right and wrong were far more complicated than he had ever imagined. He left the cabin quickly, the photographs and letters tucked securely in his coat. His mind was racing, trying to piece together the next steps. He needed to find Ricardo Rivera. He was the key. But where could he be? Rivera had been in hiding for weeks, and Alvarez knew that if he didn't move quickly, the criminal network would close in, erasing any trace of the truth. The road back to town was quiet, the only sound the crunch of gravel underfoot. As he neared the outskirts of San Luis, Alvarez's thoughts turned to Isabel Morales, the widow who had pointed him toward Rivera. She had seemed so fragile, so lost in her grief. But was it possible that she knew more than she was letting on? Was she involved in this web of deceit? Had she been complicit in her husband's dealings, or was she simply another victim caught in the crossfire? Alvarez couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in his gut that Isabel's role in this story was far from over. But for now, his priority had to be Rivera. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. The next morning, he met with his partner, Officer Marta Gonzalez, in the cramped office they shared in the town's small police station. Gonzalez, a sharp, no-nonsense officer, had been skeptical of Alvarez's theories about Morales' death from the start. She had been quick to point out that the town was small, that there was no need to overcomplicate things. But now, after seeing the evidence Alvarez had brought back from the cabin, her attitude had shifted. "Is there anything else we're missing?" Gonzalez asked, looking at the stack of photographs and documents on the desk. Alvarez ran a hand through his hair, his brow furrowed. "I'm not sure. Everything points to Rivera, but I don't think we've seen the whole picture yet. Whoever killed Morales didn't just do it for money. There's something much bigger at play here." Gonzalez leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing. "You think Rivera's just a pawn in this game?" "I do," Alvarez replied. "I think he's a piece of a much larger puzzle. And I'm starting to think that this network isn't just based in Argentina. It's bigger than that, much bigger. We're dealing with people who have resources, who have power. Then we're not just up against a small-time thief, are we?" Gonzalez said, her voice grim. "No," Alvarez said quietly. "We're up against something far more dangerous." They sat in silence for a moment, each contemplating the magnitude of what lay ahead. The quiet town of San Luis, once a peaceful haven, had become ground zero for a criminal conspiracy that threatened to tear everything apart. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, Alvarez knew that his investigation was only just beginning. He had a choice to make: follow the trail wherever it led, even if it meant taking down powerful enemies who were willing to kill to protect their secrets, or step back and let the darkness consume the town. There was no turning back now. The only thing he knew for certain was that he had to keep pushing forward. The truth was out there, and he would find it no matter the cost. Let's jump to next story. Story 10. The sun hung low in the sky over the dusty streets of Montevideo, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the cracks in the pavement. The air was thick with the scent of the nearby port, mingling with the faint trace of gasoline from the taxis that sped through the narrow streets. It was a city caught between the past and the present, modern in some ways, but deeply entrenched in old secrets. Secrets that seemed to weave their way through every alley, every corner, and every conversation. Detective Leonardo Sanchez had walked these streets for years, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. It was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It lingered like the ever-present humidity in the air, seeping into his bones and making his mind race with possibilities. He had been assigned to investigate the murder of a man named Arturo Delgado, a well-known figure in the city's underworld. Delgado was no stranger to trouble, but his death had raised more questions than answers. It wasn't just the brutal way he had been killed, stabbed multiple times and left in an abandoned warehouse near the port. It was the timing of it all. The murder occurred just days after Delgado had made a deal with someone in the government. The whispers around town suggested that Delgado had been involved in smuggling operations that linked South America to the United States, a connection that would have been worth millions in illicit trade. But who would want him dead? And why? Sanchez had been at the scene of the crime, staring at the blood-stained floor where Delgado's body had been found. The place was quiet now, but he could still hear the echoes of the violence that had unfolded there. He ran his fingers through his dark hair, his mind working through the puzzle pieces that were scattered in front of him. The only problem was that none of them seemed to fit together. He stood up from where he had been crouched over the body, his boots making a soft echo as they tapped against the cold concrete floor. The warehouse had once been a thriving place, buzzing with activity and filled with the sound of machines. But now, it was a place of silence and decay, much like the life that Delgado had led. Sanchez couldn't help but feel that the man's death was just the tip of the iceberg, that something much darker was lurking beneath the surface, waiting to come to light. As he left the warehouse, Sanchez was greeted by the dim glow of the city lights. He slipped his hands into the pockets of his coat and took a deep breath, trying to clear his mind. The streets of Montevideo were alive with the hustle and bustle of the evening, but there was an undercurrent of tension that he couldn't ignore. The city had always had its share of crime, but this felt different, bigger somehow. The murder of Delgado was a catalyst, the beginning of something that would unravel the very fabric of the city. Sanchez's phone rang, breaking the stillness of the moment. He pulled it from his pocket and glanced at the screen. It was his partner, Detective Claudia Mendoza. They had been working together for years, and he trusted her instincts as much as his own. "Leonardo, I've got something," Mendoza's voice crackled through the speaker, her tone urgent. I just spoke to someone who said they saw a man leaving the warehouse the night of the murder. A tall man, dressed in all black. Doesn't sound like the usual suspects we deal with. Sanchez's interest piqued. Did they get a good look at him? Not exactly, Mendoza replied. But they said he was carrying something, a briefcase. Not the kind of thing you'd expect a street thug to be carrying. It's too clean, too professional. A briefcase. It was a detail that didn't sit right with Sanchez. Delgado was no businessman. He was a criminal, involved in the murky world of smuggling, bribery, and organized crime. A briefcase didn't belong in that world. But it did belong in a different one, the kind of world that dealt with large sums of money, corporate deals, and dirty politics. All right, I'm on my way to the station, Sanchez said, his mind already racing with possibilities. Meet me there in 20 minutes. As he drove through the city, the streets became darker, the buildings more worn. The lights flickered above him, casting an eerie glow on the faces of the people who wandered through the night. In a city like this, you learned quickly to keep your distance from the shadows. But tonight, the shadows felt different. They were deeper, more insidious. At the station, Sanchez found Mendoza waiting for him, her face grim as she leaned against the desk, a stack of files in front of her. When she saw him, she straightened up and gestured toward the files. I pulled everything we have on Delgado. There's more to his story than we thought. Sanchez took a seat across from her, scanning the documents. There were bank records, names of known associates, and references to shipments that had come through the port. But there was one thing that stood out, a reference to a man named Javier Vasquez. Vasquez was a name Sanchez had heard before, but not in connection to Delgado. Vasquez was known to be a powerful figure in the criminal world, linked to several high-profile drug cartels and illegal arms deals. If he was involved in Delgado's death, it meant this was far from a simple murder. Javier Vasquez, Sanchez muttered, his eyes narrowing as he read the file. This is getting bigger than I thought. Mendoza nodded. It's not just the drug trade anymore. There's something going on with the politicians, too. I've been hearing whispers that Delgado had dirt on a few powerful people in this city. People who would kill to keep their secrets buried. Sanchez rubbed his temples, the weight of the case beginning to sink in. It's a mess. We've got smuggling, drugs, politics, and now this briefcase. Whoever killed Delgado wanted to make sure something stayed hidden. But what? What was in that briefcase? Mendoza looked at him, a glint of realization in her eyes. Maybe it wasn't just about Delgado's death. Maybe it was about what he was going to expose. What if the briefcase had the key to all of this? What if it had the evidence we need? Sanchez leaned forward, his mind turning over the possibilities. We need to find that briefcase. The next day, the search for Delgado's briefcase took them deeper into the city's underbelly. They visited local informants, questioned small-time criminals, and combed through any lead that could bring them closer to the truth. It was a grueling process, one that seemed to stretch on forever. But then a break came. A young woman, barely in her 20s, approached Sanchez at a cafe on the outskirts of town. Her clothes were tattered, her face drawn with the weight of hardship. She looked around nervously before sitting down across from him. I know something about Delgado, she said in a hushed voice. He had a meeting a few days before he was killed. It wasn't with any of the usual people. He met with a man named Gabriel Salazar. Sanchez's ears perked up at the name. Gabriel Salazar was a fixer, a man who worked behind the scenes, cleaning up messes for powerful people who didn't want their secrets exposed. He wasn't a criminal in the traditional sense, but he was deeply involved in the world of corruption. If Salazar had been involved in Delgado's final days, it could only mean one thing. Delgado had been sitting on something explosive. The woman handed Sanchez a small, crumpled piece of paper, scribbled with a location and a time. He was supposed to meet someone there after Delgado died, she added, her voice shaking. I think they were looking for the briefcase. Sanchez stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. This was the lead that would take them to the heart of the conspiracy. As he walked out of the cafe, he knew that they were about to uncover something that would change everything. The truth was just around the corner, hidden in the shadows, waiting to be exposed. And Sanchez was determined to find it, no matter the cost. The city's skyline was starting to fade in the rearview mirror as Sanchez and Mendoza drove toward the meeting location. The streets grew quieter, less familiar. The areas they were passing were once bustling with life, but now they seemed desolate, abandoned. The echo of their car tires on the cracked asphalt was the only sound that seemed to matter, and the tension inside the vehicle was palpable. Sanchez gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white from the strain. Mendoza was beside him, her eyes scanning the surroundings, alert but focused. They had reached the edge of Montevideo, heading into an industrial zone near the outskirts of the city. Factories, warehouses, and vacant buildings lined the streets like forgotten sentinels, silent witnesses to the city's darker past. As they neared the location specified on the crumpled note, Sanchez's gut twisted. Something felt off, as though they were walking into a trap. The further they went, the more isolated they became, the more it felt like the walls were closing in on them. Sanchez parked the car a block away and turned off the engine. He glanced at Mendoza, his eyes narrowing with determination. "We don't know who we're dealing with yet," he said, his voice low. "Stay sharp." Mendoza nodded and reached for her weapon, checking to ensure it was securely holstered. Both of them knew this could be dangerous. They were heading into unknown territory, with a lead that could unravel a web of corruption, crime, and violence that stretched far beyond what either of them had expected. But they had come this far, and there was no turning back now. The street was quiet, too quiet. There were no signs of life, no distant voices, just the occasional sound of a dog barking somewhere in the distance. The meeting place, a crumbling warehouse, loomed ahead like a shadow, its broken windows staring back at them like hollow eyes. The door was ajar, and a soft light flickered inside, casting strange, elongated shadows across the cracked concrete. Sanchez and Mendoza exchanged a look, their unspoken communication enough to confirm what they both knew. They were about to walk into something that could change the course of everything. They moved toward the door, their steps muffled by the dust-covered floor. As they crossed the threshold, the faint smell of mildew and rust filled the air. It was a place that had been abandoned for years, but something felt alive in the shadows. Inside the warehouse, there was no one in sight, but the faint glow of a single hanging light revealed a table in the center of the room. A man was standing near the table, his back to them, a briefcase placed carefully on the surface. The man was tall, wearing a dark suit, and his posture was stiff, deliberate. "Gabriel Salazar?" Sanchez's voice echoed in the stillness of the warehouse, the tension rising in his chest. The man didn't turn around immediately, but his hands shifted ever so slightly. He knew they were there. He had known they would come. After a long pause, Salazar finally spoke. "You're late," he said in a smooth, almost bored tone. "I expected you much sooner." Sanchez and Mendoza approached cautiously, their eyes never leaving the man. They could see the briefcase now, its sleek, black surface reflecting the dim light. There was something almost too perfect about it, too calculated. "We're not here to play games, Salazar," Sanchez said, his voice firm. "We're here for the briefcase. The one you took from Delgado." Salazar's lips curled into a slight smile, but his eyes remained cold. "You think it's that simple, detective? You think you can just waltz in and take what you want? This is much bigger than your little investigation. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Sanchez's patience was wearing thin. "I know enough. Delgado was murdered because of that briefcase. People are dying because of what's inside it. What's so important about it?" Salazar finally turned around to face them, his face a mask of indifference. "You really want to know? Fine. But understand, once you open that Pandora's box, there's no going back." He reached down and opened the briefcase, slowly, deliberately. Inside, instead of the expected stacks of cash or documents, there was only a single manila folder, worn and slightly creased. Sanchez stepped forward, but Salazar raised a hand, stopping him. "Careful," Salazar warned, his voice dropping to a whisper. "What's inside that folder could destroy everything you think you know about this city, about the people in power." Mendoza stepped forward, her eyes narrowing at the folder. "What's in it?" she asked, her tone firm. Salazar hesitated for a moment, and in that moment, Sanchez saw a flicker of something. Fear, maybe? It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same cool demeanor. "It's evidence," Salazar said, his eyes flickering briefly to the folder. "Evidence of corruption at the highest levels. Not just in Montevideo, but across the country. Government officials, businessmen, drug lords, all of them connected. Delgado had been gathering information for years, trying to use it as leverage, but he wasn't the only one after it." Sanchez's mind raced. This wasn't just about Delgado's murder anymore. This was about a conspiracy so vast, it had the potential to bring down the entire country. "We know about Delgado," Sanchez said, his voice low and steady, though inside his mind was racing. "But you're saying this goes beyond him. Who else is involved?" Salazar's eyes darkened. "It's not just about one person. There are too many names to mention, politicians, businessmen, police officers. It's a network that's been built over decades. And now you've stumbled into it. You think you can stop it. You think you can expose the truth. Sanchez didn't answer immediately. He just stared at the folder, his mind churning with the weight of the information. The implications were staggering. If this was true, it wasn't just about a murder. It was about an entire system built on lies, greed, and blood. "Tell me where to find the people behind this," Mendoza said, her voice cold and hard. "Tell me who's next." Salazar laughed, a dark, humorless sound. "You won't get the answers you want. But I'll tell you this, if you open that folder, you'll be signing your death sentence. The people who control this city won't let you walk away. Not alive." Sanchez and Mendoza exchanged a look. They both knew what they had to do. There was no turning back now. Sanchez reached for the folder, his fingers brushing against the worn edges. The room seemed to close in around him as he opened it, knowing that whatever he found inside would change everything. The truth was within their grasp, and it would either save them or destroy them.